What if entire chapters of history vanished without leaving a clear explanation? Cities were abandoned, archives disappeared, treasures went missing, and strange structures remained behind with no surviving record of their purpose. These are not legends built from imagination. They are fragments of the past that still resist simple answers, and each one raises the same unsettling question: how much of history has quietly disappeared? The vanished city of Ai-Khanoum. There are places in history that disappear slowly, leaving behind ruins that tell a long and complicated story. And then there are places that seem to fall silent almost completely. Ai-Khanoum belongs to the second category. The city once stood in a region far removed from the image many people have of the ancient Greek world. Yet its disappearance has become one of those historical puzzles that forces researchers to confront how incomplete the surviving record really is. The mystery is not simply that Ai-Khanoum vanished. It is that a city could exist, develop, and become part of a wider cultural world, and then leave behind ruins without giving us a complete explanation for what happened to it. Today, the remains of Ai-Khanoum are archaeological evidence of a settlement whose story can only be reconstructed in fragments. Walls survive, foundations survive, objects survive, but the full human story behind the city's disappearance does not, and that distinction matters. An abandoned city is not automatically a mystery. Cities can disappear for many ordinary reasons. Populations move, political systems change, trade routes shift, economic importance declines. Conflict can alter a region. Environmental pressures can make a settlement less attractive. The problem at Ai-Khanoum is that the surviving evidence does not give us a single, definitive explanation that closes the case. Instead, researchers are left with a much more frustrating picture. A real city existed. Its remains prove that. But the final chapter is incomplete. Imagine approaching the site when it was still alive. Instead of broken foundations and exposed stones, you would have seen an organized urban landscape. Buildings stood where ruins now lie. People moved through streets and public spaces. Administrative activity took place somewhere within the settlement. Objects were produced, used, stored, traded, and eventually abandoned. Every ordinary activity left some kind of trace, but ordinary human lives are difficult for archaeology to recover. A stone wall can survive for centuries. A document may not. A conversation disappears immediately. A decision made by a ruler may leave no physical evidence at all. The reasons why a family leaves its home may never be recorded. That is where the mystery begins. Archaeology gives us physical remains, but physical remains do not automatically explain human decisions. At Ai-Khanoum, the ruins become a kind of incomplete sentence. We can see that something existed. We can study what remains, but the missing words are often the ones we most want to know. Why did the city cease to function? What happened to the people who lived there? Was its disappearance sudden, gradual, or connected to changes that unfolded beyond the city itself? The available summary of the mystery does not provide a definitive answer to these questions. That uncertainty has to remain part of the story, and perhaps that is what makes Ai-Khanoum more fascinating than a mystery with a neat solution. A solved mystery gives us an ending. An archaeological mystery often gives us a boundary. On one side of that boundary is evidence, on the other is silence. Ai-Khanoum represents that silence remarkably well. The temptation when discussing ancient mysteries is to fill empty spaces with dramatic explanations. When records disappear, people naturally want to imagine a hidden catastrophe or a secret event. But responsible history requires restraint. The absence of an explanation is not proof of an extraordinary explanation. It simply means the evidence does not allow us to be certain. That may sound less dramatic, but in reality, it makes the mystery more powerful. Because the unanswered question is real. There is no need to invent a hidden story when the surviving evidence already shows us how much has been lost. Think about what a city actually requires to function. There must be food. There must be water. There must be organization. There must be people performing thousands of small tasks every day. There must be structures for administration, exchange, production, storage, movement, and social life. A city is not just a collection of buildings. It is a network of human relationships. When that network disappears, the buildings can remain standing long after the society that gave them meaning has gone. That creates one of archaeology's strangest visual experiences. You can stand among structures that once belonged to a living community, yet there is nobody left to explain what each place meant. A room may survive. Its original conversation does not. A pathway may remain visible. The footsteps are gone. A wall can tell us where something stood. It cannot always tell us why. This is particularly important when examining the disappearance of Ai-Khanum. The mystery is not about whether the city existed. The archaeological remains make that clear. The mystery lies in the gap between existence and disappearance. Somewhere between the city at the height of its life and the ruins encountered by later generations, something changed. And that change is difficult to reconstruct completely. This is a recurring problem in ancient history. Modern people often imagine history as a continuous chain of written records. One event leads to another. One ruler follows another. One civilization replaces the previous one, and eventually historians arrange everything into a clean timeline. But the ancient world did not leave behind a perfect archive. Records are uneven. Some periods are richly documented, others are almost silent. Some cities leave inscriptions, others leave only foundations. Some rulers are remembered, others disappear entirely. And sometimes the physical remains of a civilization survive while the explanation for its transformation does not. Ai-Khanum stands inside that uncomfortable space. The city is evidence of a past that was once ordinary to the people living there. For them, the streets were not archaeological ruins. The buildings were not historical curiosities. The city was simply home. People woke there. They worked there. They moved through its spaces without imagining that thousands of years later, strangers would stand among the ruins and try to understand what happened. That is perhaps the most human part of the mystery. We often study ancient civilizations through their monuments, rulers, armies, and political systems. But a banished city reminds us that history is also made of ordinary lives. And ordinary lives are among the easiest things for history to lose. A ruler can leave a monument. A civilization can leave a temple. An empire can leave a road. But the individual person who carried water, prepared food, repaired a wall, traded an object, or walked through the city at sunset may leave almost nothing identifiable behind. When a settlement disappears, thousands of such lives can vanish from the historical record at once. What remains is architecture. What remains is archaeology. What remains is the question. Ai-Khanum therefore becomes more than a vanished city. It becomes an example of how fragile historical memory can be. A place can be physically present and historically absent at the same time. Its stones can remain visible while its story becomes increasingly difficult to recover. This is why archaeological research is so important. Every fragment can matter. A piece of architecture may reveal how a building was organized. An artifact may indicate what people used in daily life. A fragment of writing, if preserved, can provide a name or a decision that would otherwise be lost. Even the absence of something can sometimes become meaningful evidence, although it must be interpreted carefully. Researchers are essentially trying to reconstruct a vanished world from incomplete pieces. But reconstruction is not the same thing as certainty. There is a difference between saying, "This is what the evidence demonstrates," and saying, "This is what might have happened." That difference is especially important when discussing mysteries. The less evidence we have, the easier it becomes to mistake imagination for history. Ai-Khanum does not need that treatment. Its mystery already exists in the gap between what archaeology can reveal and what it cannot. The vanished city asks a deceptively simple question. How does a place disappear? Not physically. The ruins remain. But how does a city disappear from the human world? How does a place once filled with voices become silent? How does a functioning community become a collection of structures that future generations must interpret? And how much information disappears with the people themselves? Those questions extend far beyond Ai-Khanum. They reach into the entire study of ancient history, because the past we know is not necessarily the past that existed. It is the portion that survived. That distinction changes the way we look at ruins. A broken wall is not simply an old wall. It is surviving evidence from a much larger story. A buried foundation may represent only the smallest visible part of a society that once depended upon it. And an abandoned city can be a reminder that historical memory is selective, not because someone necessarily chose what to preserve, but because time itself removes almost everything. Iconium, therefore, remains compelling precisely because the evidence does not give us a perfect ending. The city can be studied, its remains can be mapped, its architecture can be examined, its surviving objects can be interpreted. But the complete explanation for its disappearance remains outside what the provided evidence can establish. And that is the real lesson hidden inside the ruins. History is not simply a record of what happened. It is also a record of what survived long enough to be discovered. Between those two things lies an enormous territory of uncertainty. Iconium occupies part of that territory, a vanished city whose physical remains survived while the complete explanation for its disappearance did not. Thousands of years later, the silence remains. And sometimes, the silence itself is the mystery. The Lost Desert Libraries of Palmyrene Merchants. A library does not have to disappear in flames to become lost. Sometimes what vanishes is not a building, but the knowledge contained inside it. Names, accounts, correspondence, records of journeys, details of trade, and private decisions can all disappear together, leaving historians with only fragments of the world they once described. That is the mystery surrounding the Lost Desert Libraries of Palmyrene Merchants. Palmyra is remembered as a place where commerce and distant connections shaped life across the ancient desert. But behind the visible city was another world, one built from information. Merchants depended on knowledge. They needed to know what goods were moving, where they were going, who was responsible for them, and which relationships connected one place to another. Trade was not simply the movement of objects. It was the movement of information. And somewhere within that system, records once existed that could have preserved an extraordinary amount of detail. Today, those records are largely absent. That absence creates a very different kind of historical mystery. When a ruined building disappears, archaeologists can sometimes reconstruct its walls. When an artifact survives, it can reveal how people lived. But when an archive disappears, the loss is harder to measure because we cannot see everything that is missing. We only see the silence left behind. Imagine opening a room that once belonged to a successful merchant. Shelves might have contained documents. Tables might have been covered with written records. Messages could have arrived from distant trading partners. Accounts could have recorded transactions. Names could have connected individuals across cities and regions. A single archive could have preserved years of commercial activity, and then imagine that archive no longer exists. The building might survive, the city might survive, the roads might survive, but the voices preserved in those documents are gone. That changes what we can know about the people who used those networks. Palmyrene merchants were part of a world in which long-distance trade required organization. Goods moved across difficult landscapes, and every journey depended upon people maintaining relationships over distance. The merchant who left one city was connected to people who remained behind. A shipment had to be recognized. A payment had to be understood. A transaction needed some form of memory. Written records were one way of creating that memory. And when those records disappear, the structure of that commercial world becomes harder to see. This is why archives are so important to historians. A monument tells us that someone wanted something built. An inscription can tell us a name. But an archive can reveal relationships. It can show how people interacted over time. It can expose the ordinary machinery of a society, the part that rarely appears in grand monuments. And merchants were especially likely to generate this kind of material. Their lives depended upon communication. Their businesses crossed boundaries. Their activities connected communities that might otherwise appear unrelated. A surviving merchant archive could therefore reveal a much larger world. But the Palmyrene Desert Libraries remain largely beyond our reach. That phrase, lost libraries, can create an image of enormous rooms filled with endless shelves of books. The reality of ancient records was more varied. The important point is not the appearance of the archive. It is the information it contained. Every document represented a piece of memory, a name, a transaction, a journey, an agreement, a dispute, a relationship. Once the document disappeared, that particular piece of memory became much harder, or perhaps impossible, to recover. This creates a strange imbalance in the history of trade. We can sometimes identify the major places involved. We can see evidence that distant communities were connected. We can study surviving objects that moved across regions. But the people who actually organized those movements are much harder to follow. Their stories were often recorded in practical documents rather than monuments. And practical documents are exactly the kind of evidence that can be especially vulnerable to disappearance. A merchant does not usually build a giant monument to commemorate a shipment. A transaction may have been important to the people involved, without being important enough to preserve for thousands of years. That means modern historians can inherit a strange version of the past. The large structures remain. The small human records vanish. The result is a history that can look more mysterious than the original world actually was. The people living in Palmyra did not necessarily experience their lives as mysterious. They knew who they were. They knew their businesses. They knew their families. They knew the routes they traveled and the people they trusted. The uncertainty belongs to us. Thousands of years later, we are the ones trying to reconstruct their world from incomplete evidence. That is one of the most fascinating aspects of ancient history. Mystery is sometimes created not by something inexplicable happening, but by the disappearance of information that once made everything understandable. The missing Palmyrene libraries illustrate that perfectly. Somewhere in the past, information existed that could have answered questions we now have to ask indirectly. Who were the merchants? How extensive were their connections? What did they record? Which places appeared most often in their documents? How did commercial relationships change? What personal stories were preserved in those records? We cannot simply assume that every missing archive contained answers to all of these questions. That would go beyond the evidence. But the possibility itself demonstrates what is at stake. A lost archive is not merely a pile of missing documents. It is a missing perspective. And perspectives matter. Ancient history is often reconstructed from the viewpoint of rulers, states, armies, temples, and official inscriptions. Merchant records could offer something different. They could reveal the practical world beneath political history, the world of contracts, shipments, partnerships, debts, travel, negotiation, and personal correspondence. That is the history of people who made civilization function without necessarily becoming famous, and when their records vanish, an entire layer of history becomes harder to recover. The desert makes this mystery especially striking. Deserts can preserve ruins for long periods, yet they can also make the disappearance of human activity visually dramatic. A once active route can become empty. A settlement can become quiet. A building can lose its purpose. The landscape remains while the human network disappears. Imagine an ancient merchant leaving Palmyra with goods destined for another region. His journey would have depended on knowledge that had been accumulated over time. He needed people. He needed routes. He needed agreements. He needed confidence that others would recognize the transaction. Behind that individual journey stood a much larger system. And systems leave records. When those records vanish, the system becomes harder to see. This is why the mystery is not simply about books or documents. It is about memory itself. Every civilization creates ways to remember. Some use monuments. Some use inscriptions. Some rely heavily on written archives. Some preserve knowledge through institutions and traditions. But none of these systems is permanent. Once the chain of preservation breaks, information can disappear surprisingly quickly. The disappearance of the Palmyrene merchant archives therefore raises a larger question. How much of ancient economic history has been lost simply because the records that documented everyday activity did not survive? There is no precise answer. And it would be misleading to pretend that historians can calculate everything that vanished, but the uncertainty is important. Because what survives in archaeology is not necessarily a complete sample of what once existed. It is a selection created by time. Some materials survive, others disappear. Some locations are excavated, others remain buried. Some records are discovered, others may never be found. That means the ancient world we reconstruct is necessarily incomplete. The lost desert libraries of Palmyrene merchants make that limitation visible. They remind us that a civilization can leave behind impressive architecture while losing much of the information that explains how its people actually lived. A city can survive as ruins, Its commercial memory can disappear. And when that happens, historians are forced to work around the silence. They compare surviving evidence. They examine archaeological remains. They follow traces of trade. They identify connections between places. But there is always a point where reconstruction must stop. Beyond that point lies uncertainty, and responsible history does not hide that uncertainty. It acknowledges it. That is what makes the lost libraries so compelling. There is no need to imagine a secret civilization or invent a dramatic final event. The mystery is already profound enough. There was once information. That information mattered to the people who created it. Then the information disappeared. The merchants continued to belong to history, but their own records no longer speak for them. Their buildings, roads, goods, and surrounding landscape can provide clues. Their complete written memory cannot. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing about lost archives. A vanished document does not look like a ruin. There is no wall to photograph, no doorway to excavate, no tower standing against the horizon. Instead, there is an invisible absence. We know that information once existed because a functioning society required communication and organization. But the precise contents of much of that lost record are beyond recovery. So the desert preserves a strange contradiction. The landscape can remain, the city can remain, the traces of commerce can remain. Yet the human explanations behind them can disappear. And when that happens, history becomes less like reading a finished book, and more like reconstructing a torn manuscript. Some sentences remain, others are missing. The spaces between them become questions. The lost libraries of Palmyra merchants belong to those spaces. They represent the enormous amount of ordinary human knowledge that can vanish without leaving an obvious monument behind. And they remind us that perhaps the greatest historical mysteries are not always the things we discovered and failed to explain. Sometimes they are the things we know once existed, but will never be able to read again. The disappearance of the royal archives of Pergamon. A kingdom can lose a city and still remember its history. It can lose a ruler and still preserve the ruler's name. But when a royal archive disappears, something much larger is lost. The records that once explained decisions, relationships, administration, and daily affairs can vanish at the same time. The physical kingdom may remain visible in ruins, yet the written memory that once connected those ruins can be gone. That is the mystery surrounding the royal archives of Pergamon. Pergamon became an important center of power and culture, but somewhere within its history was a body of royal records that has not survived in the form researchers would need to reconstruct its story completely. The strange part is not simply that documents are missing. Ancient documents disappear all the time. The deeper mystery is what their absence means. What do the royal archives contain? How extensive were they? Which decisions were recorded? Which names appeared inside them? What political relationships might have been documented? And how much of Pergamon's history would look different if those records were still available? We cannot answer those questions with certainty from the information available, but the disappearance itself reveals something important about the fragility of historical memory. Pergamon was not simply a collection of buildings. Like any major ancient center, it depended upon organization. There were decisions to make. Resources had to be managed. Official matters had to be communicated. Relationships had to be maintained. Records gave institutions a way to preserve information beyond the memory of a single person. An archive was, in effect, an artificial memory for the state. Once something was written down, the information could potentially outlive the person who created it. A decision could be consulted again. A name could be preserved. An agreement could be remembered. A transaction could be checked. A royal instruction could travel beyond the moment in which it was issued. That makes the disappearance of an archive particularly significant. When the documents vanish, the state loses more than paper or tablets. Future generations lose access to the state's own voice. Imagine walking through an ancient royal complex today. Stone steps remain beneath your feet. Walls rise from the ground. Fragments of buildings reveal the scale of the settlement. You can study the architecture and try to understand how people used the spaces. But then imagine discovering that the records explaining many of those activities are missing. The buildings remain. The bureaucracy does not. The architecture survives. The explanations become uncertain. This is one of the central problems in reconstructing ancient history. Physical evidence and written evidence do different things. A building can tell us what someone constructed. A document can tell us what someone thought was important enough to record. Those are not the same thing. A palace can demonstrate wealth and organization. An archive can reveal how that organization actually worked. Without the second, the first can become difficult to interpret. The royal archives of Pergamon therefore represent a missing layer of information. They belong to the invisible infrastructure of history. And invisible infrastructure is often the easiest thing to overlook. When people imagine ancient civilizations, they tend to picture temples, statues, fortifications, palaces, and monumental architecture. But behind all of those visible achievements were countless administrative decisions. Someone had to keep track of resources, someone had to communicate instructions, someone had to preserve information, someone had to remember what had already happened. Archives provided a way to do that. Their importance is not always obvious because successful administration is supposed to be quiet. A functioning archive does not look dramatic. It is a room full of records. Yet those records can contain the information needed to understand an entire political system. Once they disappear, historians are forced to reconstruct that system from whatever fragments survived elsewhere. This creates a strange imbalance. The monumental past can remain impressive while the administrative past becomes almost invisible. A surviving stone structure might tell us that a particular institution existed. But without its records, we may know far less about the people who operated it. The names of ordinary officials can disappear. The details of decisions can disappear. The reasons behind policies can disappear. The disputes between individuals can disappear. Even seemingly insignificant documents can become valuable when viewed from thousands of years away. A routine administrative record may seem unimportant to the person who created it. To a modern historian, it could be a missing piece of a much larger puzzle. That is why lost archives are so frustrating. We do not know exactly what we have lost. If a building disappears, archaeologists can sometimes estimate its size from foundations. If a statue is destroyed, descriptions or fragments may survive, but an archive creates a different problem. Its contents may have been enormous, yet there may be no complete way to count what is gone. We cannot simply look at an empty room and reconstruct every missing document. The absence itself is difficult to measure, and that uncertainty changes the questions historians can ask. Instead of reading the original records, researchers must rely on surviving traces, names preserved elsewhere, references in other sources, archaeological remains, fragments of inscriptions, evidence from surrounding regions. Each surviving piece can become valuable because the original archive is no longer available to provide context. This is how historical reconstruction often works. It is less like reading a complete biography and more like assembling scattered photographs from a life. One photograph shows a person at one moment, another shows a different place, a third reveals a relationship. But the sequence between them is missing. The royal archives of Pergamon represent that missing sequence. They would have connected individual pieces into a larger administrative picture. Without them, that picture is necessarily incomplete. There is another reason the mystery matters. Archives do not simply preserve facts, they preserve choices. Every archive reflects what a society considered worth recording. Which events were documented, which transactions mattered, which people received official attention, which decisions were preserved, which problems were considered important. Those choices tell us something about the society itself. When an archive disappears, we lose not only the information inside it, but also the ability to study how that society organized its own memory. That makes the loss deeper than a simple shortage of historical evidence. It is the disappearance of a perspective. The royal perspective of Pergamon cannot be reconstructed perfectly from architecture alone. A palace may reveal where power was concentrated. A monument may reveal what rulers wanted remembered publicly. But an archive could have revealed what happened behind those public images, and that distinction is crucial. Public monuments are often designed to communicate. Archives are designed to operate. One presents an image. The other preserves information. When the operational records disappear, the private machinery of government becomes harder to see. This is why historians treat missing archives with such caution. It is tempting to fill the silence. Perhaps a missing record would explain a political decision. Perhaps it would clarify a disputed sequence of events. Perhaps it would identify people whose roles are now uncertain. But those possibilities must remain possibilities. A missing document cannot be used as evidence for a theory simply because we wish it had survived. That would turn an absence into a claim. The responsible approach is more restrained. We can recognize what the lost archive represents without pretending to know its exact contents. The mystery is strongest when the boundary between evidence and uncertainty remains visible. Pergamon therefore becomes a reminder of how uneven our access to the ancient world really is. Some civilizations speak to us through thousands of surviving records. Others speak through fragments. Some rulers leave detailed accounts. Others leave only names. Some cities preserve extensive archaeological layers. Others have been transformed, damaged, or lost. The historical record is not evenly distributed, and that means the ancient world we imagine is shaped by survival. The documents that remain influence the stories we can tell. The documents that disappear create blank spaces. Those blank spaces can be enormous. Consider what happens when a government loses its institutional memory. A new generation may inherit buildings, territories, traditions, and political structures, but the detailed knowledge of previous decisions may no longer be available. That is one reason archives matter so much to continuity. They allow information to cross generations. Without them, knowledge becomes more dependent on what people remember personally or what later generations choose to preserve. Over long periods of time, both can change. Names can be forgotten. Events can be misunderstood. Relationships can disappear from memory. And eventually, a society can become visible only through the fragments left behind. That is the position modern researchers face with the missing royal archives of Pergamon. They are looking at the remains of a political and cultural world while knowing that an important body of written memory has disappeared. The result is not complete ignorance. There are still clues. There are still surviving remains. There are still ways to investigate the city and its history. But the evidence cannot recreate everything that was once recorded. And that limitation should not be mistaken for failure. It is simply the reality of archaeology. Researchers are not working with the ancient world itself. They are working with what the ancient world left behind. Sometimes that is remarkably generous. Sometimes it is painfully incomplete. Pergamon belongs somewhere between those extremes. Its surviving remains allow us to recognize the importance of the city. But the disappearance of its royal archives reminds us that physical survival does not guarantee informational survival. A city can remain visible while its memory becomes fragmented. A royal complex can stand while the documents that once passed through it are gone, and a civilization can leave behind enough evidence to prove that it mattered while still withholding the answers to some of the questions we most want to ask. That is what makes lost archives so haunting. There is no dramatic monument announcing their absence. There is simply a gap, a missing collection of voices, a missing administrative memory, a missing record of decisions made by people who believed their documents would remain useful. Perhaps they expected future officials to consult them. Perhaps they were simply performing ordinary administrative work. Either way, the result is the same. The information once existed. Today, much of it does not. And that leaves Pergamon with a mystery that cannot be solved by looking at stones alone. The ruins can show us that a powerful world existed. The surviving evidence can help reconstruct parts of its story. But somewhere within the silence lies an archive that could have told us far more. Its shelves are gone from the historical record. Its documents no longer speak. And the unanswered questions they might have resolved remain suspended between what archaeology can prove and what history has lost forever. The secret ritual chambers beneath Mount Ebal high on the rugged landscape of Mount Ebal, archaeologists encountered something that seemed almost deliberately hidden by time. A stone-built ritual complex stood on the mountain, separated from the ordinary spaces where people lived and worked. Its architecture suggested ceremony, yet the surviving evidence does not provide a complete explanation of everything that happened there. That uncertainty is what makes the site so intriguing. The mystery begins with the setting itself. Mount Ebal rises above the surrounding landscape, creating a dramatic position for any structure built upon it. From such a location, the sanctuary would have existed apart from the everyday movement of settlements below. The site was not simply another domestic building. It contained ritual architecture, stone construction, a carefully arranged space, and chambers whose purpose remains difficult to explain completely from the surviving evidence. When archaeologists encounter a structure like this, the first instinct is often to ask what it was used for, but that question can be surprisingly difficult to answer. A building does not come with instructions. The people who constructed it knew exactly what each space meant. They knew where people were supposed to stand, what objects belonged there, which activities were permitted, and what the rituals represented. Thousands of years later, we see only the physical remains. The knowledge that gave those remains meaning is largely gone. That creates a fascinating contradiction. The sanctuary is evidence of an organized ritual tradition, yet the precise meaning of some of its spaces remains uncertain. Imagine approaching the mountain in the ancient world. The landscape would have looked different from the modern view. People would have moved along paths rather than roads. The mountain would have been experienced not simply as geography, but as a place within a cultural landscape. At the summit stood a structure constructed from stone. Its builders invested time and effort into arranging the space. That alone tells us something important. This was not an accidental collection of rocks. The architecture reflected intention. Someone decided where the walls should stand. Someone decided how the spaces should connect. Someone decided what the structure was meant to accomplish. But the people who made those decisions did not leave us a modern explanation. And this is where archaeology becomes both fascinating and frustrating. Archaeologists can measure walls. They can study construction techniques. They can examine pottery and other remains associated with a site. They can analyze the arrangement of rooms, but they cannot directly observe the rituals that once took place there. They have to reconstruct behavior from physical evidence. That process requires caution. A chamber may appear unusual. An arrangement may seem ceremonial. An object may seem connected to ritual activity, but appearance alone cannot prove exactly how ancient people understood the space. This distinction is especially important at Mount Ebal. The sanctuary has generated questions because its architecture suggests ritual significance, while the complete explanation for its function remains uncertain. The mystery is therefore not whether the site had meaning. It almost certainly did. The mystery is how much of that meaning can still be recovered. A ritual space is particularly difficult to interpret because rituals depend heavily on shared knowledge. A modern religious building can often be understood because visitors recognize symbols, traditions, and practices. Remove all written explanations and leave only the architecture, and interpretation becomes much harder. Now imagine removing not just the written explanation, but the entire culture that created the ritual. The challenge becomes enormous. A stone arrangement that was once immediately understandable to its builders can become a puzzle for future generations. That is what makes Mount Ebal so compelling. The site survives. The tradition does not survive in a complete form that allows us to experience it directly. We are left with the physical framework of something that once had a clear purpose. The sanctuary may have been familiar and meaningful to its original community. To modern observers, parts of it remain uncertain. That gap between certainty and uncertainty is where much of the mystery lives. One of the most intriguing aspects is the possibility of spaces beneath or associated with the main ritual structure. Underground areas naturally attract attention because they are physically separated from ordinary surroundings. A chamber beneath a sanctuary raises immediate questions. Why was it built? What was kept there? Who was allowed to enter? Was it part of a ritual process? Was it structural? Was it used for storage or another practical function? The available summary identifies these as secret ritual chambers, but it does not provide enough evidence to establish a single definitive purpose. That means the responsible approach is not to turn the uncertainty into a dramatic claim. Instead, the uncertainty itself becomes the story. There is something particularly powerful about discovering a hidden architectural space and realizing that its original users knew exactly why it existed. They did not see it as mysterious. They saw it as normal. The mystery exists only because the chain of understanding was broken. That is a recurring pattern in archaeology. The ancient world was not mysterious to the people who lived in it. It becomes mysterious when the information that made it understandable disappears. A doorway is just a doorway until its function is forgotten. A chamber is just a chamber until its purpose becomes unclear. A ritual object becomes an artifact when the tradition surrounding it disappears. At Mount Ebal, these problems come together. The sanctuary gives us evidence of deliberate ritual activity, but the surviving architecture cannot reproduce the beliefs of the people who constructed it. That is something modern archaeology has to accept. Not every ancient mystery has a hidden answer waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes the evidence simply does not preserve enough information, and that does not make the site less important. In fact, it can make the investigation more meaningful, because the goal is not to force certainty. The goal is to understand what the evidence actually allows us to say. The mountain sanctuary provides a physical record of human intention. Someone built it, someone used it, someone understood it. Then the tradition ended, changed, or disappeared from the surviving record. Eventually, the structure became something different, a ruin. The transformation from active sanctuary to archaeological site is itself remarkable. During its original use, the place would have been alive with movement. People would have approached it with expectations. They would have understood the boundaries between ordinary and sacred space. The architecture would have directed behavior. Certain areas would have had particular meanings. Certain objects would have belonged in particular places. The experience would have been cultural, social, and personal. Today, archaeologists approach the same stones differently. They measure, they photograph, they map, they compare, they interpret. The ancient visitor and the modern researcher stand in the same physical location, but experience completely different worlds. For the ancient visitor, the meaning was already known. For the researcher, the meaning is the question. That difference is easy to overlook. We often look at ancient religious structures and assume that architecture speaks for itself. But architecture has a vocabulary. Its builders understood that vocabulary. Modern observers do not automatically possess it. A ritual chamber might have been essential to the ceremony. It might have held symbolic meaning. It might have served a practical purpose within the ritual complex. Without enough surviving evidence, several possibilities may remain open. That is why Mount Ebal should not be presented as a solved puzzle. The mystery is genuine precisely because the evidence has limits, and those limits are part of the archaeological story. The sanctuary also reminds us how much human activity can disappear without destroying the physical structure itself. The stones can survive while the knowledge disappears. This is perhaps one of the most striking forms of historical loss. A building can remain almost like a message written in a language no one completely remembers. The message is there. The meaning is incomplete. Every archaeological interpretation is an attempt to translate that message. But translation requires evidence. Where evidence ends, certainty must end with it. Mount Ebal demonstrates why archaeological research is often a slow process. A single discovery may generate several questions instead of one answer. A newly exposed wall can change the understanding of an entire structure. A previously overlooked object can alter the interpretation of a room. A relationship between two architectural features can reveal that they were part of a larger design. But even after years of research, some questions can remain open. That is not a weakness of archaeology. It is a reflection of how much time removes. The people who used the sanctuary did not expect modern researchers to reconstruct every detail of their world. They built for their own community. They followed traditions that made sense to them. They left behind a structure, not a complete explanation. And so the mountain now contains two histories. There is the history of the sanctuary itself, and there is the modern history of researchers trying to understand it. The first history belongs to the people who built and used the site. The second belongs to archaeologists who encounter its remains centuries later. Between those two histories lies the mystery. What exactly happened inside those spaces? What did the chambers mean? Which rituals took place there? How did the people who used the sanctuary understand the mountain? The surviving evidence may provide clues, but the summary does not establish definitive answers, and that restraint is important. It would be easy to transform a mysterious underground space into something sensational. But the real fascination does not require exaggeration. The truth is already remarkable. People once created a carefully organized sacred place on a mountain. They gave its architecture meaning. They used spaces that now seem mysterious, and eventually the living tradition behind those spaces became inaccessible to us. Today, the sanctuary remains as stone, The rituals are gone, the voices are gone, the explanations are incomplete. What remains is an archaeological puzzle shaped by the most basic force in historical research: time. Time does not simply destroy buildings, it separates us from the people who knew what those buildings meant. Mount Ebal stands as a powerful reminder of that separation. The stones have survived long enough to ask questions. The people who could have answered them are no longer here. And somewhere within the quiet chambers of the ancient sanctuary lies a meaning that was once obvious to everyone who entered, but is now only partially visible through the remains they left behind. The unidentified bodies buried at Dura Europachanter. There are archaeological discoveries that answer questions, and then there are discoveries that seem to create even more. At the ancient settlement of Dura Europos, researchers encountered evidence connected to unidentified bodies buried within the site. Their presence raises an unsettling but important historical question. Who were these people, and why were they buried there? The difficulty is not simply identifying the remains, it is understanding the circumstances surrounding them. The surviving evidence does not provide a complete explanation. There is no simple record that tells us exactly who these individuals were, what brought them to Dura Europos, or why their remains were deposited in the places where archaeologists found them. That uncertainty makes the discovery particularly valuable. Because sometimes archaeology gives us something that written history cannot. It gives us evidence of people whose names have disappeared. Dura Europos was a place where different communities, traditions, and political influences could meet. Its remains provide a physical record of a settlement with a complicated history. Buildings, streets, religious spaces, defensive structures, and everyday objects can reveal pieces of that world. But human remains introduce a different kind of question. A building can tell us that a community existed. A burial can tell us that an individual was present. Yet the identity of that individual may remain completely unknown. Imagine uncovering a burial after centuries underground. The first thing you notice is not a name. There may be no inscription identifying the person. No surviving voice explains who they were. Instead, there is simply physical evidence that someone lived, died, and was placed in that location. For historians, that creates an unusual relationship with the past. The individual is physically present, but historically anonymous. That anonymity can be difficult to overcome. Names are among the most powerful pieces of historical evidence because they connect a human being to a wider story. Without a name, a person can become a statistic. But archaeological remains remind us that every anonymous burial once belonged to an actual individual, someone with a life that may have included family, work, beliefs, fears, responsibilities, and relationships. Almost none of that personal information necessarily survives. This is one of the reasons unidentified burials are so important. They challenge the tendency to see ancient history only through famous people. Kings have names. Generals have names. Rulers sometimes leave inscriptions. But ordinary people often disappear almost completely. Their existence survives only through the material remains they left behind. At Dura Europos, the unidentified bodies represent that quieter side of history. The evidence tells us that these individuals were part of the ancient settlement's human story, but it does not give us enough information to reconstruct that story completely. That distinction matters. It would be easy to invent identities. Perhaps they were soldiers, perhaps they were residents, perhaps they were travelers, perhaps they belonged to another group. But unless the evidence establishes those possibilities, they must remain possibilities. The mystery is not strengthened by pretending to know. It becomes stronger when we recognize exactly what remains unknown. Archaeology often works this way. Researchers begin with physical evidence. They document the location. They examine associated objects. They study the architecture around the discovery. They compare the burial with other evidence from the site. Each piece may narrow the possibilities, but narrowing possibilities is not the same as finding a definitive answer. The unidentified bodies at Dura Europos therefore occupy an uncertain space. We know they existed. We know archaeologists encountered their remains, but the full explanation of their identities and circumstances remains incomplete. That gap is important because burial practices can reveal how societies understood death and community. Where a person was buried can matter. How they were positioned can matter. Objects associated with a burial can matter. The relationship between a burial and surrounding architecture can matter, but interpretation requires caution. A burial does not automatically explain itself. The same physical arrangement can potentially have different meanings depending on the culture and circumstances involved. Without sufficient supporting evidence, archaeologists must resist the temptation to turn a possibility into a conclusion. That is especially important when the subject is sensitive. Human remains are not simply archaeological objects. They belong to people. So the most responsible way to approach the mystery is with restraint. The question is not, how can we make this discovery more frightening? The question is, what can these remains actually tell us? And perhaps just as importantly, what can they not tell us? That second question is often ignored, yet it is essential. The unidentified bodies cannot automatically tell us their names. They cannot automatically explain their lives. They cannot automatically reveal why they were buried where they were, and they cannot provide a complete narrative simply because archaeologists discovered them. Instead, they offer fragments. Those fragments become part of a much larger attempt to reconstruct Dura Europos. The settlement itself is valuable because it preserves traces of different aspects of ancient life. Religious architecture reveals beliefs and ritual activity. Residential remains reveal domestic life. Public structures reveal organization. Defensive architecture reveals the importance of protection. And burials reveal something deeply personal. They show how people dealt with the physical remains of those who had died. When unidentified bodies appear within that landscape, they become part of the settlement's human puzzle. Who were they? What relationship did they have with the surrounding community? Were they buried according to a recognized custom? Was their burial unusual? Did their location have a particular significance? The available summary does not provide definitive answers to these questions. That uncertainty should remain visible. There is something powerful about that kind of mystery because it does not depend upon dramatic storytelling. It depends upon absence. The absence of names, the absence of complete records, the absence of a clear explanation. In many ways, that is what makes archaeology different from written history. Written sources often tell us what someone wanted remembered. Burials can reveal people who are never recorded in surviving texts at all. The unidentified individuals at Dura Europos therefore offer a glimpse into a part of history that is usually difficult to access. The history of people whose names did not survive. Think about how much of a person's identity can disappear. A name can vanish. A profession can vanish. A family connection can vanish. A person's own understanding of their life can vanish. Eventually, only physical traces may remain, and even those traces can become separated from their original context. That is why archaeology has to be careful. Every object is evidence, but evidence is not automatically an explanation. A fragment can suggest. A structure can indicate. A burial can raise questions, but the final interpretation must remain proportional to what the evidence supports. This is particularly important when discussing Dura Europos, because the unidentified bodies can easily become the center of speculation. People naturally want to know what happened. They want a clear story. But history does not always provide one. Sometimes the most accurate conclusion is simply that the evidence remains insufficient. That may sound unsatisfying, but it is intellectually honest. And there is something fascinating about that honesty. It allows the mystery to remain open without turning uncertainty into fiction. The bodies also remind us that ancient settlements were made of people, not just architecture. When we look at ruins, it is easy to imagine an empty world. Stone walls, broken streets, abandoned rooms, silent temples. But those structures once existed within a human environment. People entered them. People worked there. People formed relationships there. People experienced ordinary days there, and people eventually died there. The unidentified burials make that human dimension impossible to ignore. They turn an archaeological site into something more personal. The question is no longer only what happened to a building, it is what happened to a person. And because the identities remain uncertain, the question becomes even more difficult. There is no biography to follow, no known family history, no surviving personal account, only the remains. That is a sobering reminder of how uneven historical memory can be. Some individuals are remembered for thousands of years. Others disappear almost completely. The difference is not always based on importance. It can simply be a matter of what evidence survived. A ruler may have had inscriptions commissioned. An ordinary person may have left nothing written. Thousands of years later, one becomes a historical figure. The other becomes an unidentified burial. But that difference should not make the second life less meaningful. If anything, it reminds us how much of human history exists outside the written record. The unidentified bodies at Dura Europos therefore matter even without a dramatic explanation. They represent people whose stories have been reduced to fragments. They demonstrate the limits of historical reconstruction, and they show why archaeology is not simply about discovering old objects. It is about recovering pieces of human experience. Sometimes those pieces fit together neatly, sometimes they do not. At Dura Europos, the unanswered questions remain. Who were these individuals? What circumstances brought them to their final resting places? How did the community understand their burials? What did their presence mean within the wider settlement? The evidence available here does not settle those questions, and that is precisely why the mystery remains. There is no need to add an invented event or an unsupported explanation. The uncertainty is enough. Centuries have passed since these individuals were placed in the ground. The society that knew them has disappeared. The people who could have explained their identities are gone. The records that might have connected them to their wider world may not have survived. What remains is a small physical connection between the present and an otherwise inaccessible human story. Archaeologists can uncover the evidence. They can document it. They can compare it. They can ask increasingly precise questions. But there is a point where the evidence stops speaking clearly. At that boundary, speculation begins. Responsible history knows where that boundary lies. The unidentified bodies of Dura Europa stand directly on it. They remind us that the ancient past is not simply a collection of famous civilizations and monumental achievements. It is also made of anonymous people whose lives mattered deeply to those around them, even if almost nothing about them survived. Their names may be lost. Their personal stories may be inaccessible. Their reasons for being buried where they were may remain uncertain, but their physical presence survived long enough for modern researchers to encounter them, and that alone creates a remarkable connection across time. The mystery at Dura Europos is therefore not only about death, it is about memory. It is about what happens when a person's existence survives, but their identity does not. The bodies remain as evidence. The explanations remain incomplete. And somewhere between those two facts lies a story that history has preserved only in fragments. The disappearance of the Mauryan Empire's iron workshops. An empire can disappear from history in many ways. Sometimes its rulers are forgotten. Sometimes its cities fall silent. And sometimes the mystery is hidden in something much less visible, the disappearance of the workshops that once supported its economy. That is the puzzle surrounding the Mauryan Empire's iron workshops. The mystery is not simply about iron, it is about infrastructure. Workshops are where raw materials become useful objects. They are places of production, organization, skill, and labor. They require people who understand the process, tools to carry it out, and systems capable of supporting the workers. When those workshops disappear from the historical picture, an important part of an empire's economic story disappears with them. The Mauryan Empire was supported by systems far more complicated than the monuments we might associate with ancient power. An empire requires administration, it requires resources, it requires skilled workers, it requires skilled workers, it requires tools. And behind many of those tools are workshops that rarely receive the same attention as palaces or royal centers. This is what makes the disappearance of the Mauryan iron workshops so interesting. The physical remains of production may be limited, scattered, or difficult to connect into one continuous story. Yet the existence of ironworking activity points toward a much larger network of skilled labor and economic organization. Imagine an ancient workshop at the height of its activity. The air would have been filled with the sounds of work. Metal was heated. Tools were shaped. Materials were handled repeatedly. Skilled workers understood processes that had been developed through experience. The workshop itself was part of a larger system. Raw materials had to arrive. Finished products had to go somewhere. Workers needed food and shelter. Someone had to organize production. Someone had to maintain the equipment. The workshop was therefore not an isolated building. It was one part of an economic network. And when such workshops disappear, the disappearance raises a larger question. What happened to that network? The available summary does not provide a definitive explanation. That uncertainty is important. It means we should not assume that the workshops all vanished at the same moment, or that one dramatic event explains their disappearance. The mystery is simply that an important element of Mauryan iron production is no longer visible in the historical record in the way we might expect. That creates a gap. And gaps are where archaeological questions begin. Iron is particularly interesting because it connects technology with everyday life. Metal objects can serve practical purposes. They can support agriculture. They can support construction. They can contribute to transportation, craftsmanship, and many other activities. But the workshop that produces those objects is often less visible than the objects themselves. A finished tool can survive as an artifact. The knowledge and labor required to create it are harder to preserve. This is one reason ancient technology can appear mysterious. We see the result. We do not always see the complete process. We can hold an ancient object in a museum and admire its craftsmanship. Yet the people who made it remain anonymous. Their workshop may have disappeared. Their methods may only be partially understood. Their economic organization may be difficult to reconstruct. The Mauryan iron workshops fit into that larger problem. The disappearance of production sites can create the illusion that technology itself simply appeared and disappeared. But technology does not work that way. It depends on people. Knowledge is learned. Skills are passed between workers. Tools are maintained. Materials are obtained. Production is organized. A functioning workshop is therefore evidence of a living tradition. When that tradition becomes archaeologically difficult to trace, historians have to ask what changed. Did production move elsewhere? Did the organization of workshops change? Did demand change? Did political or economic structures shift? The provided summary does not answer these questions, and it would be irresponsible to invent an answer. Instead, the mystery lies in the disappearance itself. This is where economic history becomes fascinating. Political history often focuses on rulers and territories. Economic history looks underneath. Who made the tools? Who processed the materials? Who transported them? Who paid for the work? Where did the finished products go? What happened when the system changed? These questions can reveal how a society actually functioned. The loss of iron workshops therefore matters because it represents the disappearance of a piece of that underlying system. An empire is often imagined from above. Kings, administrators, military power, large territories. But an empire also exists from below. Farmers produce food, craftsmen produce tools, workers process materials, merchants move goods, administrators organize resources. Without those layers, political power cannot function for long. The workshops represent one of those hidden layers. They may not have looked impressive. They may not have been designed to impress anyone. But they were part of the machinery that allowed society to operate. This creates an interesting contrast. Monumental architecture is deliberately visible. Industrial production often is not. A palace announces authority. A workshop simply produces something useful. Yet thousands of workshops can have a greater effect on daily life than a single monument. When their remains disappear, the historical record becomes distorted. The visible remains of a civilization can survive while the productive infrastructure that supported it becomes difficult to see. That is why archaeological evidence has to be read carefully. A missing workshop does not automatically mean production stopped. Absence of evidence is not proof of complete absence. A production center may have shifted. Materials may have been reused. Structures may have disappeared. Later activity may have covered earlier remains. The evidence may simply be incomplete. These possibilities do not solve the mystery, but they remind us why caution matters. The disappearance of Mauryan iron workshops should not be turned into a dramatic claim about a sudden technological collapse unless the evidence establishes one. The summary does not establish that. What it gives us is something subtler, a historical question about why a known form of production becomes difficult to trace. That question is valuable precisely because it forces us to look beyond rulers and monuments. Consider the people who worked inside these workshops. Their names are not preserved in the summary. Their individual stories are unknown, yet their skills were essential. A person who knew how to work iron possessed knowledge that had practical value. That knowledge could be taught. It could be improved. It could be carried from one place to another. It could become part of a family tradition or professional community. When workshops disappear from the record, we also lose visibility into those people. Their contribution becomes anonymous. The objects may survive, the workers do not. This is one of the most persistent problems in ancient history. We often remember the person who commissioned something. We rarely remember the people who actually made it. A ruler might be associated with a monument. The craftsman who shaped its materials may never be named. The same is true of industrial production. An empire may be remembered for its achievements. The anonymous workers who made those achievements possible can disappear almost completely. The Mauryan iron workshops therefore represent more than an economic mystery. They represent a human one. Who were the people who worked there? How was their knowledge organized? How did they obtain their materials? How did their production connect with the wider Mauryan economy? And why did the archaeological trace of those workshops become so difficult to follow? The available information cannot provide definitive answers. But those questions remain useful because they direct attention toward the ordinary infrastructure of civilization. There is another layer to the mystery. Workshops are places where knowledge becomes physical. A craftsman understands how material behaves. That understanding is transformed into an object. The object can survive for centuries. The knowledge behind it is much more fragile. If a tradition is interrupted, later generations may possess the object without possessing the complete process used to make it. That is why technological history is often reconstructed from fragments. Archaeologists examine tools. They examine production remains. They study furnaces, waste material, and finished objects when available. They try to understand what happened between raw material and finished product. Every fragment helps. But a complete production system is difficult to reconstruct. The disappearance of the Mauryan iron workshops illustrates that problem. The workshops themselves were temporary human environments. They existed because people needed to produce something. Once the activity changed, the structures could lose their purpose. The building might be abandoned, its materials might be reused, the surrounding landscape might change. Eventually, the workshop becomes difficult to distinguish from everything else. Thousands of years later, the economic system that once made the workshop necessary may be invisible. What remains are fragments, and those fragments have to carry the weight of reconstruction. This is why archaeology can feel like detective work. But unlike a modern investigation, the witnesses are gone. There is no worker to interview, no manager to question, no ledger to open, no surviving instruction manual explaining the process. The researcher has only material evidence and whatever records happen to survive elsewhere. Sometimes that is enough. Sometimes it is not. In the case of the Mauryan iron workshops, the mystery remains because the available evidence does not provide a complete explanation for their disappearance. And that is exactly where the story should end, not with an invented catastrophe, not with a dramatic theory presented as fact, but with the recognition that something important existed and later became difficult to trace. That uncertainty tells us something about how fragile economic history can be. Political systems leave monuments. Economic systems often leave waste. And waste can disappear. Workshops can be dismantled. Tools can be reused. Buildings can collapse. Knowledge can move elsewhere. People can leave. The result is that an entire industrial network can become almost invisible. The Mauryan iron workshops therefore remind us that history is not only about what civilizations built. It is about how they produced the things that allowed society to function. Behind every tool is a process. Behind every process are skilled people. Behind those people is a system of knowledge and organization. When the physical evidence of that system disappears, a part of the civilization's story disappears with it. The mystery is not that iron existed. It is that the places and systems responsible for producing it can become so difficult to recover. And once those workshops fall silent, the silence tells us something profound. Civilizations are not held together only by kings and monuments. They are held together by countless ordinary places where people work. When those places vanish from the record, the history of an entire society can become harder to understand. The Mauryan iron workshops are one of those missing pieces. Their disappearance leaves behind an unanswered economic question and a reminder that some of the most important parts of ancient history may have existed far away from the monuments we still see today. The missing treasury of King Perseus of Macedon. A royal treasury should be one of the easiest things in history to track. It represents wealth collected by a kingdom, controlled by its ruler, and used to support the machinery of government. Precious materials, valuable objects, financial resources, and records of ownership can all become evidence of a state's economic power. But what happens when the treasury itself becomes a historical mystery? That is the question surrounding the missing treasury of King Perseus of Macedon. The mystery is not simply about money. It is about the disappearance of something that should have been closely connected to the power of a king. A treasury represents accumulated resources. It tells us that a state had wealth, that someone controlled that wealth, and that the resources were important enough to be protected and managed. When that treasury can no longer be clearly accounted for, the historical picture becomes incomplete. Where did it go? Was it moved? Was it divided? Was it abovid? Was it absorbed into another political system? Or did parts of it disappear through circumstances that the surviving record no longer explains? The available information does not provide a definitive answer, and that uncertainty is exactly what makes the mystery worth examining. King Perseus of Macedon belonged to a political world in which wealth and authority were closely connected. A ruler did not simply possess territory. Political power depended upon resources. A kingdom needed to support administration. It needed to maintain institutions. It needed access to valuable materials and economic resources. The royal treasury represented a concentrated form of that power. It was not merely a collection of valuable objects. It was part of the machinery of kingship. That makes the missing treasury particularly interesting. If the treasury disappears from the historical record, the question becomes larger than, where is the treasure? The deeper question is, what happened to the wealth that represented the power of the Macedonian monarchy? Imagine entering a royal treasury while it was still functioning. The room would not simply represent wealth. Every object inside would have a purpose within the kingdom's larger system. Resources were accumulated over time. Some could have been reserved. Some could have been used for government. Some could have represented the king's ability to respond to political circumstances. The treasury was therefore connected to decisions. Its contents were part of the kingdom's future. And then imagine that the treasury no longer exists as a clearly traceable historical entity. The physical wealth may have been dispersed. The records may have disappeared. The ownership may have changed. What remains is uncertainty. This is one of the most difficult problems in studying ancient wealth. Money and valuable objects are portable. A palace can remain in one location. A wall can remain where it was built. A treasury's contents can move. They can be divided. They can be transferred. They can be absorbed into another collection. Once that happens, identifying the original source can become extremely difficult. A valuable object may survive while its history disappears. A resource may be recorded once and then never mentioned again. A treasury can therefore vanish without physically disappearing all at once. Its contents can simply become disconnected from the institution that once controlled them. That possibility makes the mystery especially complicated. The word treasury creates a mental image of a single hidden chamber filled with wealth. But a royal treasury is better understood as a financial institution or collection of resources rather than simply one room. Its contents could represent accumulated wealth belonging to the monarchy. Its location could change. Its management could change. Its ownership could change. And when political circumstances shift, the treasury can become part of the transition. That is why the mystery of Perseus's treasury cannot be solved simply by searching for a hidden room. The real historical problem is tracing the movement of wealth, and that is much harder. Ancient records are incomplete. Objects can lose their original context. Political control can change, and later generations may preserve wealth without preserving information about where it came from. This creates a fascinating distinction between physical survival and historical survival. Something can survive materially, but disappear historically. A valuable object may still exist somewhere. But if nobody knows its original connection to Perseus, it no longer functions as evidence of his treasury in the same way. The object remains, the story disappears. This is one reason provenance matters so much in archaeology and history. An artifact without context can be difficult to interpret. Knowing where something came from can be as important as the object itself. A coin, vessel, inscription, or valuable object can tell a very different story depending on its archaeological and historical context. Remove that context, and much of the information is lost. The missing treasury of Perseus therefore raises questions about both wealth and memory. What happened to the physical resources, and what happened to the records that could have explained their movement? The provided summary does not establish a complete answer to either question. That means the mystery must remain open. But an open question can still teach us something. It reveals how unstable the connection between political power and historical memory can be. A king may control enormous resources during his lifetime. Centuries later, historians may struggle to reconstruct where those resources went. The political institution can disappear, the wealth can be redistributed, the records can vanish. The original ownership can become uncertain, and eventually, the treasury becomes a historical question rather than a visible reality. There is also a human dimension to this mystery. Royal wealth does not exist in isolation. It is connected to people. Officials manage it. Craftsmen produce valuable goods. Merchants participate in economic networks. Administrators keep records. Rulers make decisions about resources. Every treasury therefore represents a network of human activity. When the treasury disappears, the economic relationships surrounding it become harder to reconstruct. We lose more than a list of valuables. We lose part of the story of how power operated. This is why the mystery of Perseus's treasury belongs in a documentary about unexplained historical losses. It demonstrates that something as tangible as wealth can become surprisingly difficult to trace. We tend to imagine that valuable things are preserved because people have an incentive to protect them. But preservation is not the same as documentation. A resource can be protected while being transferred. It can be transferred while being renamed. It can be divided among different holders. It can be incorporated into another political system. Each step creates distance from its original identity. Over enough time, that distance can become almost impossible to cross. The treasury's disappearance therefore represents a problem of historical continuity. At one point, the wealth belonged to a recognizable political authority. At another point, that connection becomes unclear. The surviving evidence does not provide a complete bridge between those moments. That missing bridge is the mystery. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere, the entire treasury remains intact, waiting to be discovered. But there is no basis here for claiming that. The available information does not establish that a single hidden cache exists. It simply tells us that the treasury is missing from the historical record. That distinction is important. The most interesting mysteries are not always buried treasure stories. Sometimes they are questions about how objects and resources move through history. A treasury can disappear without disappearing physically. Its contents can become scattered. Its identity can become lost. Its records can vanish. Its political meaning can be forgotten. And once those connections break, reconstruction becomes extremely difficult. Consider how different the story of Perseus might look if complete treasury records had survived. Researchers could potentially trace resources. They could understand how wealth was managed. They could identify important transfers. They could see what the monarchy considered valuable. They could understand the economic pressures surrounding the kingdom. But when such records are missing, historians have to rely on fragments. And fragments rarely provide the whole picture. This is a recurring problem in ancient history. The surviving evidence is often shaped by chance. Some materials survive because they were durable. Others disappear because they were fragile. Some records were preserved. Others were discarded. Some objects remained in recognizable contexts. Others were moved and reused. The historical record is therefore not a perfect archive. It is the result of thousands of years of selection. The missing treasury of Perseus demonstrates how powerful that process can be. The wealth itself may once have been obvious. Its location and ownership may once have been completely understood. To the people living at the time, there may have been no mystery at all. The mystery exists because the chain connecting then to now has been broken. This is one of the most important ideas in historical research. The past does not become mysterious because ancient people were necessarily trying to hide something. It can become mysterious simply because information was lost. The people of Perseus's world knew what happened to the treasury. They did not need to leave a mystery behind, but when the records and institutions disappeared, later generations inherited an incomplete story. That is how ordinary history can become an extraordinary puzzle. A treasury that once represented certainty becomes a historical unknown. A collection of resources becomes a question, and the absence of an answer invites speculation. But speculation must remain separate from evidence. We cannot say exactly where the treasury went based only on the information provided. We cannot claim that it was hidden. We cannot claim that it was destroyed. We cannot claim that it was destroyed. We cannot claim that it was secretly transported elsewhere. Those are possibilities someone might imagine, but they are not established facts here. The responsible conclusion is simpler. The treasury associated with King Perseus is missing from the historical record, and its fate remains unclear. That may sound restrained, but it captures something genuinely fascinating about the ancient world. Political power leaves traces. Wealth leaves traces, yet neither is guaranteed to leave a complete record. A king can possess resources that later become almost impossible to trace. The people who manage those resources can disappear. The records can disappear. The political system can disappear. And eventually, historians are left with a question that once would have been completely ordinary. Where did it go? That question has survived precisely because the answer has not. And the missing treasury of Perseus reminds us that history can lose not only buildings and documents, but the physical evidence of wealth itself. A kingdom may leave behind ruins, a ruler may leave behind a name, but the resources that once made that ruler powerful can become disconnected from the story. When that happens, the treasury becomes more than lost wealth. It becomes a missing piece of political history, a piece that once belonged to a king, a piece that once represented the strength of a kingdom, and a piece that, for reasons the surviving record does not fully explain, can no longer be traced with certainty.
The unidentified astronomical symbols in Egyptian temples. Ancient temples were not simply places of worship. They were also places where people observed the world around them, recorded ideas, organized knowledge, and gave meaning to things they believed were important. That is why mysterious astronomical symbols can be so revealing. Inside Egyptian temples, researchers have encountered symbols and representations connected with the heavens whose exact meaning is not always immediately clear. They look deliberate. They were placed within carefully designed religious environments. Yet the surviving evidence does not provide a complete explanation for every symbol, and that creates a fascinating problem. We can see the images, we can study their position, we can compare their forms, but can we confidently say what the people who created them intended? That is where the mystery begins. Look at an ancient temple from a distance, and its purpose may seem obvious. Massive stone walls rise above the surrounding landscape. Columns support monumental halls. Reliefs cover surfaces that were designed to last. The entire structure communicates permanence. But walk closer, and the building becomes more complicated. Every carved image has a context. Every symbol occupies a particular space. Every figure may relate to other images around it. And the deeper we look, the more questions appear. Ancient Egyptian culture placed enormous importance on the sky. The movement of celestial bodies was visible to everyone. The sun appeared and disappeared each day. The night sky followed patterns. The changing position of stars created a natural framework through which people could understand time and the world around them. But recognizing the importance of astronomy does not automatically tell us what every astronomical symbol meant. That distinction is essential. It is tempting to look at an unusual image and immediately assign it a modern interpretation. A shape resembles a star. Another looks like a celestial body. A particular arrangement appears mathematical. And suddenly the temptation is to say that ancient Egyptians were recording something specific. But resemblance is not proof. Symbols can have several layers of meaning. An image may have religious significance. It may represent an astronomical concept. It may function as part of a larger symbolic system. Or it may have meanings that are difficult to recover because the original context has been partially lost. This is what makes temple imagery so challenging. The ancient people who created it did not need to explain every symbol in the way a modern museum label does. They already understood the cultural language surrounding it. The image made sense because everyone in that environment knew how to interpret it. Thousands of years later, we are trying to learn that language from fragments. Imagine entering one of these temples when it was still active. The walls would not have appeared old or mysterious. The carvings would have been part of a living religious environment. People would have approached them with expectations. Priests and visitors would have recognized symbols that modern observers might struggle to interpret. A particular celestial representation could have carried meaning that was obvious to its original audience. Today, the same image can become a puzzle. This is one of the central difficulties of studying ancient symbolism. Meaning is rarely contained entirely inside the picture. It depends on context. Consider a simple modern symbol. Without knowing its cultural background, someone from another civilization might misunderstand it completely. The same problem applies to ancient Egypt. A modern observer sees a shape. An ancient Egyptian may have seen a concept. That difference can be enormous. It means that interpreting astronomical symbols requires more than identifying what they resemble. Researchers must consider where the symbols appear, what surrounds them, how they relate to other imagery, and what the wider temple environment tells us. Even then, some questions may remain unresolved. The mystery becomes particularly interesting when symbols appear to contain astronomical ideas that cannot be confidently explained from surviving evidence. What were they intended to communicate? Were they connected to observation? Were they primarily religious? Did they combine several meanings at once? The provided information does not establish a definitive answer, so the uncertainty must remain part of the story. That may sound cautious, but it is actually what makes the subject fascinating. The unanswered question is not an invention. It comes directly from the limits of interpretation. Ancient astronomy was not necessarily separated from religion in the same way modern disciplines are. Today, we often divide knowledge into categories. Astronomy belongs to science. Religion belongs to belief. Architecture belongs to engineering. Art belongs to culture. But ancient societies did not always organize knowledge according to modern categories. A celestial symbol inside a temple could potentially have several meanings at the same time. It could relate to the heavens while also belonging to a religious tradition. It could represent an observation while functioning symbolically. That possibility makes simple interpretations dangerous. A modern viewer might ask, what astronomical object is this? The ancient viewer may have asked a completely different question. What does this celestial image mean within the order of the world? Those are not necessarily the same question. And this is why temple symbols can remain mysterious even when the images themselves are perfectly visible. We can photograph them. We can measure them. We can reproduce them. But meaning is harder to preserve than stone. Stone can survive thousands of years. Context can change. Languages can become difficult to interpret. Religious traditions can disappear. And once the people who understood the symbols are gone, the images can remain while their complete meaning becomes uncertain. That is a recurring pattern in ancient history. The physical object survives. The cultural knowledge does not. Egyptian temples demonstrate this problem particularly well because their walls contain enormous amounts of visual information. The surfaces are not empty. They are crowded with images, inscriptions, figures, symbols, and carefully organized scenes. The sheer quantity of information can create an illusion of certainty. We may think that because there is so much material, everything must be understandable, but abundance does not guarantee clarity. 1,000 symbols do not help if the system that connected them is only partially understood. In fact, complexity can sometimes make interpretation harder. One image may depend upon another. A symbol may change meaning depending on where it appears. A celestial representation may be part of a larger composition rather than an isolated statement. Without understanding the complete visual language, interpretation becomes an exercise in reconstruction. Researchers must ask what the original viewer would have recognized immediately. That is not easy. The original viewer possessed cultural knowledge that modern researchers have to rebuild from evidence, and some of that knowledge may simply be gone. This is where the astronomical symbols become more than an artistic mystery. They become evidence of lost knowledge. The symbols suggest that ancient Egyptians had ways of thinking about the heavens that were meaningful within their society. But the exact connection between the images and those ideas is not always recoverable. That leaves us with an intriguing imbalance. The temple preserves the expression. It does not necessarily preserve the explanation. A symbol can survive perfectly while its original interpretation becomes uncertain. This is why archaeologists and historians often resist definitive claims when dealing with ancient imagery. There is a major difference between identifying a symbol and understanding it. We can identify a star-like shape. That does not automatically tell us what the symbol represented. We can identify a celestial pattern. That does not automatically tell us why it was placed in that particular location. We can recognize astronomical themes. That does not automatically tell us whether the original purpose was observational, religious, symbolic, or some combination. Those distinctions matter. They prevent the mystery from becoming mythology, and they keep the focus on the actual historical question. What did the people who created these symbols believe they were communicating? That question cannot always be answered completely, but researchers can still learn from the attempt. They can compare symbols across temple contexts. They can examine inscriptions that survive near the imagery. They can study the architecture surrounding the symbols. They can look for patterns. Every comparison can reduce uncertainty, but reducing uncertainty is not the same as eliminating it. Some interpretations become more convincing than others, some possibilities become less likely, and some questions remain open. That is the nature of historical investigation. The mystery of Egyptian astronomical symbols, therefore, does not depend on claiming that ancient people possess secret knowledge beyond modern understanding. There is no need for that. The real mystery is more human. People thousands of years ago looked at the same sky we see today. They watched celestial movements. They created symbols to express ideas about that sky. They placed those symbols inside monumental temples. And now, thousands of years later, we are trying to understand exactly what those images meant to them. That is a remarkable connection across time. The stars have changed little from the human perspective. The culture that interpreted them has changed enormously. The same night sky can therefore carry completely different meanings for different civilizations. An ancient priest could look upward and see a world organized through religious and cultural ideas. A modern astronomer can look upward and see physical processes described through scientific models. Both are looking at the same universe, but they are asking different questions. The temple symbols belong to that ancient way of seeing, and when the cultural framework disappears, the symbols become harder to decode. This is why archaeological mysteries are often really mysteries of interpretation. The object itself is not necessarily hidden. The meaning is. That distinction makes the Egyptian temple symbols especially compelling. They are visible. They are deliberate. They survived. Yet their full significance remains uncertain. And uncertainty does not mean that researchers know nothing. Quite the opposite. The symbols provide evidence that can be studied carefully. The challenge is knowing where interpretation ends and speculation begins. A responsible historical approach respects that boundary. It does not fill every unanswered question with a dramatic theory. Instead, it allows the evidence to remain incomplete when necessary. That may be frustrating, but it is also honest. And sometimes honesty creates a more interesting mystery than certainty ever could. Because once we admit that we do not fully understand a symbol, another question appears. How much ancient knowledge has disappeared without leaving enough explanation behind? How many ideas once seemed obvious to their original audiences but now require reconstruction? How many cultural meanings were so deeply embedded in daily life that nobody thought they needed to be written down? We cannot know the exact number, but the surviving temple imagery demonstrates that the loss can be significant. The ancient Egyptians did not necessarily create their astronomical symbols for future archaeologists. They created them for their own world. Their audience already understood the language. That meant explanations were not always necessary. The symbol itself could carry the message. And when the cultural system surrounding that symbol disappears, modern observers inherit the message without the complete key. That is the heart of the mystery. The images survived. The people who understood them did not. The temple walls remain silent, not because they contain no information, but because the information is embedded in a cultural language that is only partly recoverable. The unidentified astronomical symbols of Egyptian temples therefore represent something larger than a question about stars. They represent the fragility of human knowledge. Knowledge can be written. It can be carved. It can be illustrated, but knowledge also depends on people who understand what those marks mean. When those people disappear, even the clearest image can become mysterious. Thousands of years later, the symbols remain fixed in stone. The sky they once represented is still above us, but the precise meaning that connected those two worlds remains partly hidden. And that is what makes these ancient symbols so compelling. They show us that sometimes the most difficult historical mysteries are not things we cannot see. They are things we can see perfectly and still cannot fully understand. The strange underground tunnels of Cappadocia, beneath the familiar landscape of Cappadocia, lies a world that seems almost impossible to understand from the surface. The region is famous for unusual rock formations and ancient settlements, but the mystery becomes deeper when the landscape is viewed underground. Hidden beneath the ground are extensive tunnels and subterranean spaces whose scale and organization raise a simple but difficult question. Why did people create them? The existence of underground architecture is not itself mysterious. People have always used underground spaces for practical reasons, but Cappadocia presents a more complicated picture. Some of its underground structures extend beyond what we might expect from a simple storage area or small shelter. Their passages, chambers, and interconnected spaces suggest deliberate planning, and yet the complete purpose of these tunnels is not always obvious. That uncertainty makes them one of the most fascinating architectural mysteries in the region. Imagine standing on the surface of Cappadocia. You see an extraordinary landscape shaped by time. Rock formations rise from the ground. Valleys stretch between cliffs. Settlements appear among the unusual terrain. From above, the landscape looks open. But beneath your feet, another environment exists. Passages descend into the earth. Rooms open into rooms. Narrow corridors lead deeper into darkness. The surface world and underground world are connected, but they feel completely different. That contrast is one of the first things that makes Cappadocia's underground architecture so compelling. Above ground, the landscape is enormous and open. Below ground, movement becomes controlled. Walls surround you. Passages narrow. Light becomes limited. Every space appears to have been shaped intentionally. And once you begin asking why, the mystery becomes much larger. What problem were these tunnels designed to solve? Were they created primarily for shelter, storage, protection, community use, ritual purposes? Or did different spaces serve different functions over time? The available information does not establish a single definitive answer. That is important because underground structures naturally invite speculation. Their darkness makes them seem mysterious. Their complexity makes them seem secretive. But mystery does not automatically mean that their original builders intended to conceal something extraordinary. The most responsible approach is to focus on what the architecture tells us. Someone deliberately carved or constructed these spaces. That required labor, it required planning, and it required a reason. The tunnels therefore provide direct evidence of organized human activity beneath the surface. The question is, what motivated it? Think about the effort involved. Creating an underground space is different from simply building a wall. The material must be removed. The passage must remain stable. People must be able to move through it. Rooms must connect logically. Entrances and exits have to work. The builders needed to understand their environment. They were not working randomly. The architecture reflects decisions. Those decisions are now separated from us by centuries. The people who created the tunnels knew exactly what they were doing. For them, the underground environment was not mysterious. It was part of their world. They understood which corridors led where. They knew which chambers were important. They understood how the spaces were meant to be used. Modern visitors enter the same structures with none of that original knowledge. That difference is crucial. A tunnel can appear strange simply because we no longer possess the cultural context that made it ordinary. This is a recurring problem with ancient architecture. A building survives longer than the people who used it. Its physical form remains. Its original purpose becomes uncertain. Cappadocia makes that problem especially dramatic because the architecture is hidden. An above-ground structure can be studied from the outside. An underground structure reveals itself gradually. A visitor enters through one opening and discovers that the space continues beyond what can immediately be seen. One chamber leads to another, A corridor disappears around a corner. The architecture creates a sense of depth. That physical experience can easily influence how we interpret the site. But the mystery should not depend on atmosphere alone. The real question is historical. What do these underground spaces tell us about the communities that created them? At the very least, they reveal that people were capable of transforming the landscape beneath their settlements. They did not simply adapt to the surface, they modified the environment itself. That suggests planning, labor, and shared knowledge. An underground complex also changes the relationship between architecture and daily life. Above ground, buildings interact with sunlight, weather, roads, agriculture, and open space. Underground, those conditions change. Temperature, light, movement, and visibility become different. That means an underground structure can provide opportunities that surface buildings cannot. But it can also create limitations. Light is restricted. Ventilation becomes important. Movement can be difficult. The environment is enclosed. So why choose to build below ground? There may not be one universal answer. Different chambers could have served different functions. The same complex could also have changed over time. A space created for one purpose might later be reused for another. This is one of the difficulties of interpreting ancient architecture. We tend to search for a single original function. But human beings reuse buildings. They adapt spaces. They modify them. They add new rooms. They block old entrances. They create new pathways. Over time, a structure can become a layered record of changing needs. Cappadocia's tunnels may therefore represent more than one moment in history. The architecture we see could reflect accumulated decisions made by different communities. Without complete records, it is difficult to reconstruct every stage. That uncertainty should not be mistaken for failure. It is simply part of the evidence. The tunnels themselves become the primary source. Their dimensions matter. Their arrangement matters. Their relationship to the surface matters. The surrounding landscape matters. Every feature can provide clues. But clues do not always produce certainty. This is why underground archaeology requires patience. Researchers must carefully document spaces that may be difficult to access. They have to map passages. They need to distinguish natural formations from human modifications. They must determine how different chambers relate to each other. The process is not about finding one dramatic object. It is about understanding an entire environment, and that environment can challenge our assumptions about ancient communities. We often imagine early settlements as small collections of simple buildings. Underground Cappadocia complicates that picture. The tunnels demonstrate that people could organize space in sophisticated ways. They could think beyond the visible landscape. They could create environments that extended deep beneath the surface. That does not tell us exactly why they did it, but it does tell us that their architectural capabilities were substantial. There is also something psychologically striking about underground architecture. A surface settlement is visible. Anyone approaching can see its buildings. An underground complex is different. Its most important spaces can remain hidden from ordinary view. That creates an immediate sense of secrecy. But again, secrecy should not be assumed simply because something is underground. The reason could be practical. The architecture may have provided protection from environmental conditions. It may have supported storage. It may have allowed communities to use space efficiently. It may have been connected to security, or it may have served purposes that modern researchers cannot yet define with confidence. The evidence provided for this mystery does not establish one final explanation. That makes the uncertainty itself important. The tunnels raise questions precisely because the architecture is more complicated than a simple answer can explain. One of the most fascinating aspects is the scale of the underground world. A single small chamber would be interesting. A connected network is something else. Networks require relationships between spaces. They require planning. A person creating one room does not necessarily need to think about a larger system. A person creating interconnected passages must think differently. They must understand movement. They must anticipate how people will use the space. They must decide where one passage ends and another begins. That makes the tunnels evidence of collective planning. Somewhere in the past, people shared an understanding of how these spaces should function. That knowledge may have been passed between generations. Builders could have learned techniques from earlier structures. Communities could have modified existing tunnels rather than starting from nothing. The result could be an underground environment shaped gradually over time, but without complete records, it is difficult to separate the different phases. This is one reason archaeology avoids overly simple narratives. A structure may look unified today even if it was created in stages. A corridor may be older than the room it connects to. A chamber may have been reused. An entrance may have been changed. What looks like one design may actually be a history of adaptation. Cappadocia's underground tunnels therefore represent a mystery not only of purpose but of development. How did these spaces evolve? Which parts belonged together? Which functions changed? Which communities modified them? The available summary does not answer those questions, but it gives us enough to understand why the architecture continues to attract attention. The underground world challenges the idea that ancient life happened only in visible buildings. Human beings were willing to reshape the earth itself. They created spaces that could not be understood simply by looking at the landscape from above. That is an extraordinary achievement, even before we know precisely why it was done. And perhaps that is where the mystery becomes most interesting. We do not need to assume an extraordinary explanation. The architecture itself is extraordinary enough. Someone looked at the ground and imagined rooms beneath it. Someone organized passages. Someone developed techniques for creating and maintaining those spaces. And communities eventually use them. The complete story is not survived. That missing explanation creates the historical mystery. The tunnels also demonstrate the importance of distinguishing between what is known and what is imagined. We know underground structures exist. We know they were intentionally created or modified. We know their architecture is complex enough to raise questions about their function. But the summary does not provide a definitive answer explaining every tunnel and chamber. Therefore, the most honest conclusion is that their precise purpose remains uncertain. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the reason the investigation continues. Every new archaeological observation can potentially change how researchers understand the spaces. A newly mapped corridor might reveal a relationship between two areas. A previously overlooked feature might provide evidence about use. A better understanding of the surrounding settlement might explain why underground construction became important. The mystery can become narrower without necessarily disappearing. That is how archaeological knowledge develops, not through one dramatic revelation, but through the accumulation of small pieces of evidence. Cappadocia is especially powerful because the landscape itself preserves the contrast. The surface is open, the underground is enclosed. The surface appears natural. The underground reveals deliberate human intervention. The surface is immediately visible. The deeper architecture has to be discovered. That contrast turns the landscape into a physical reminder of how much of human history can remain hidden beneath ordinary ground. For generations, people lived above these spaces. For generations, knowledge about their use could have been passed along. Then, eventually, the original context became harder to recover. The tunnels remained. The explanations became uncertain. That is the central mystery. Not simply how the tunnels were made, but why their original meaning is no longer completely accessible. A passage can survive for centuries. A tradition may not. A stone wall can preserve its shape. A cultural memory can disappear. And once the memory is gone, even an enormous underground complex can become a historical puzzle. Cappadocia therefore offers a remarkable example of the difference between physical survival and cultural survival. The architecture survived. The complete explanation did not. Today, researchers can enter the tunnels, map them, photograph them, and study their construction. They can reconstruct parts of the underground environment, but they cannot simply ask the original builders what each space meant. Those people are gone. Their voices are gone. Their world has changed. What remains is stone, earth, architecture, and questions. And perhaps that is why the underground tunnels of Cappadocia remain so compelling. They remind us that ancient mysteries do not always come from spectacular monuments or famous rulers. Sometimes they are hidden beneath our feet. A corridor disappears into darkness. A chamber opens beyond it. Another passage leads somewhere else. The architecture continues while the original explanation becomes harder to recover. The tunnels do not need a mythical story. They do not need an invented secret. Their real mystery is already enough. People deliberately transformed the underground landscape and created spaces whose full purpose remains uncertain. The builders knew the answer. Modern researchers have the remains. Between those 2 points lies a gap of history, and deep beneath Cappadocia, that gap is still carved into the earth. The giant Olmec-style heads found outside their core regions. Some archaeological discoveries are mysterious because almost nothing remains. Others are mysterious because something enormous remains, but its meaning, origin, or movement is difficult to explain. The giant Olmec-style heads belong to the second category. These monumental stone heads are among the most recognizable forms of ancient Mesoamerican art. Their size alone makes them remarkable. But the deeper question begins when examples associated with Olmec-style imagery are found outside the region normally considered their core area. That raises an immediate problem. How do these enormous objects, or the ideas represented by them, appear beyond the places where Olmec culture is usually centered? The evidence does not provide a simple answer. And that uncertainty is what makes the subject so fascinating. To understand why these discoveries matter, it helps to begin with the objects themselves. Imagine encountering a monumental stone head emerging from the landscape. It is not a small artifact that can be carried away unnoticed. It is a deliberate statement in stone. Someone selected or worked enormous material. Someone invested labor into shaping it. Someone decided what the finished image should represent. And someone had a reason for placing it where it was found. The scale changes everything. A small carved object can move relatively easily. A monumental stone sculpture requires planning. Its creation involves skilled labor. Its movement, if it was transported, would require additional organization. Its final placement must have mattered to the people who created it. So when a similar artistic tradition appears outside its expected core region, the question becomes much larger than simple artistic resemblance. Was the object actually transported? Was the style adopted by another community? Did people move between regions and carry artistic traditions with them? Were similar ideas developing independently? Or are modern observers seeing a connection that the ancient people themselves would not have understood in the same way? These are difficult questions, and without sufficient evidence, they cannot simply be reduced to one explanation. That is important because ancient art can create powerful visual associations. When 2 sculptures look similar, our minds immediately connect them. But similarity does not automatically prove direct contact. 2 societies can sometimes create related artistic forms for different reasons. A particular image might be copied. It might be inspired by an earlier tradition. It might be transformed by another culture. Or it might be interpreted differently after moving into a new environment. The giant Olmec-style heads therefore raise a broader question about cultural movement. How far can an artistic tradition travel? Ideas are more mobile than stone. A design can be remembered. A technique can be taught. An image can be reproduced. A symbol can be adapted. But monumental sculpture is different. Its physical presence requires much more than an idea. It requires material, labor, expertise, and organization. That is why the geographic question surrounding Olmec-style heads is so interesting. If an enormous sculpture appears outside the expected cultural center, there must be something to explain about the connection. But the explanation cannot simply be assumed. Archaeology has to examine the surrounding evidence. Where was the sculpture found? What other objects were nearby? What kind of settlement existed around it? Does the artistic style appear elsewhere in the same region? Are there signs of cultural exchange? Is there evidence that the sculpture itself moved? These questions matter because context can transform interpretation. A sculpture standing alone can be mysterious. A sculpture surrounded by related objects and architecture may become easier to understand. Unfortunately, the surviving record does not always provide enough context to resolve every question. That leaves researchers with a fascinating problem. The object exists. The artistic resemblance exists. The geographical difference exists. But the complete chain connecting those facts may remain uncertain. This is one reason ancient archaeology can be so compelling. The mystery is often not hidden inside the object. It exists between objects, between places, between cultures, between pieces of evidence that may or may not belong to the same story. The giant heads become especially intriguing because monumental art carries more than visual information. A large sculpture requires a community capable of organizing its production. Someone had to decide that creating it was worthwhile. Someone had to support the work. Skilled craftspeople had to shape the material. Other people may have been involved in preparing the site. The sculpture then had to become part of a larger social environment. That means a monumental head is evidence not only of artistic skill, but of organization. If a related style appears far from its presumed center, the question becomes one of cultural networks. How did ideas travel? How did communities influence one another? Did people move? Did objects move? Did traditions move? Or did a local community create something independently that only appears similar to modern eyes? The available summary does not allow us to choose confidently between these possibilities, and that is exactly why the mystery remains. There is another complication. The word Olmec style itself describes a connection in appearance or artistic tradition, but it should not automatically be treated as proof that every related object was produced by the same community. Historical labels are useful tools. They help researchers organize evidence. But labels can sometimes make ancient cultures seem more clearly separated than they actually were. The ancient world was not divided into neat categories. People interacted. Ideas traveled. Artistic traditions changed. Communities borrowed from one another, and regional identities could overlap. The giant heads therefore invite us to think about culture as something dynamic. A tradition does not necessarily stay inside one geographical boundary. It can influence neighboring communities. It can be transformed. It can be remembered differently. It can survive long after the original context changes. But again, this does not provide a definitive explanation for every example. It simply gives us a framework for understanding why the question is important. Imagine being one of the people who first encountered such a monumental sculpture in its original setting. The object would not have been an archaeological mystery. It would have belonged to a living society. People would have understood what it represented. They would have known why it was placed there. They might have associated it with political authority, social identity, ceremony, memory, or something else entirely. We cannot assume which meaning applied without evidence. But we can recognize that the sculpture had meaning. Monumental effort is rarely accidental. The challenge is recovering the meaning after the society that created it has disappeared. This is where modern archaeology enters the story. Researchers do not simply look at the face carved into stone, they study the material. They examine the carving, they document the location, they compare artistic features, they investigate the surrounding archaeological environment. Every detail can become evidence. The goal is not to force an answer, it is to determine what the evidence can support. And sometimes the result is frustrating. Several explanations may remain possible. No single interpretation can be proven completely. That does not mean the research has failed. It means the evidence has reached its current limit. The mystery of the giant heads is therefore also a lesson in how archaeological knowledge works. We often imagine that archaeology produces answers. Sometimes it does, but sometimes its greatest achievement is identifying the question more precisely. Instead of asking vaguely, "How did this get here?" researchers can ask much more specific questions about cultural connections, movements, artistic traditions, and context. Those questions are easier to investigate, and even when they remain unanswered, they move the discussion forward. There is also something deeply human about monumental faces. A face is immediately recognizable. We instinctively look at it and search for identity. Who is this person? What did they represent? Why was their likeness carved? The enormous scale intensifies that feeling. The head seems to demand recognition, yet the historical identity behind the image may remain uncertain. That creates a powerful contrast. The sculpture is physically enormous. The information about its original meaning can be surprisingly small. The stone speaks loudly. The historical record whispers. This contrast is part of what makes ancient monumental art so compelling. We can see the labor. We can see the craftsmanship. We can see the intended image. But we may not know the story that originally accompanied it. That story could have been preserved through oral tradition. It could have been understood through ceremonies. It could have been connected to political authority. It could have represented something that made perfect sense to its original audience. But once the cultural system disappeared, The image became detached from its original explanation. The same problem appears whenever ancient art survives without its full context. Modern viewers tend to interpret through modern assumptions. We see a face and think about portraiture. We see unusual features and look for identity. We see geographic separation and imagine migration. But the ancient creators may have been thinking about something entirely different. That is why responsible interpretation must leave room for uncertainty. The giant Olmec-style heads do not need an extraordinary explanation to remain fascinating. Their existence already raises serious questions about cultural geography and artistic transmission. If related monumental forms appear beyond the expected core region, researchers naturally want to understand the connection. But the evidence must determine the answer. A mystery is not an invitation to invent. It is an invitation to investigate. That distinction is especially important with ancient civilizations because the further back we go, the more incomplete the record becomes. Written explanations may be absent. Objects may have been moved. Sites may have been disturbed. Cultural traditions may have disappeared. And archaeological discoveries may represent only fragments of much larger systems. The giant heads exist within that incomplete world. They are surviving pieces of a cultural landscape that once made sense to the people who lived within it. Today, researchers are trying to reconstruct that landscape, and every reconstruction has limits. One of the most interesting possibilities is that cultural influence did not always move in a simple direction. Ancient communities could adopt ideas and transform them. An artistic tradition could travel without an entire population moving. A local culture could reinterpret an outside style and create something new. This makes cultural history much more complicated than drawing arrows on a map. It is not always possible to say that one group simply brought an idea to another. The relationship may have developed through multiple stages. The available information does not establish exactly how the Olmec-style heads found outside their core regions came to exist, so the mystery remains open. What we can say is that their presence challenges simple assumptions about where cultural ideas belonged. It reminds us that ancient societies were connected in ways that may be difficult to reconstruct completely, and it forces us to look beyond political boundaries. A cultural tradition does not always respect the borders modern historians create. Ideas can travel, people can travel, objects can travel, and meanings can change as they move. The giant stone heads therefore become more than isolated sculptures. They become clues to a much larger question about the ancient world. How connected were communities that now appear separated by geography? How did artistic traditions spread? How much cultural exchange has disappeared from the surviving evidence? And how much do we misunderstand simply because the evidence is incomplete? There may not be one final answer. Perhaps that is the most honest conclusion. The mystery is not necessarily that researchers have discovered something impossible. It is that the surviving evidence is not sufficient to reconstruct the complete story with certainty. The sculptures remain. The landscapes remain. Fragments of ancient cultures remain. But the explanations that once connected them may be gone. And that is one of the most persistent problems in archaeology. We inherit the remains without inheriting the world that gave them meaning. A giant stone head can survive thousands of years. The memory of why it was created may not. A cultural tradition can leave a physical trace. The story surrounding that tradition can disappear. And when an artistic form appears far from its expected center, the surviving evidence may be enough to raise a question, but not enough to close it. That is precisely what makes the giant Olmec-style heads so compelling. They are enormous reminders of a world we can see only partially. Their faces remain fixed in stone. Their creators are silent. Their journeys, connections, and meanings are not completely recoverable. And somewhere between those surviving monuments and the missing explanations lies one of history's most intriguing mysteries. How far did ancient ideas travel, and how much of that journey has disappeared with the people who once understood it? The burned Celtic sanctuary at Gorney-Sararund. Some archaeological sites are mysterious because almost nothing remains. Gorney-Sararund is different. Here, the remains themselves suggest that something deliberate happened to a Celtic sanctuary. Yet the surviving evidence does not provide a complete explanation for why the site was burned. That creates a difficult historical question. What happened at Gorney-Sararund, and what did the destruction of the sanctuary mean to the people who used it? The mystery begins with the word sanctuary. A sanctuary is not simply a building. It is a place given a particular meaning by a community. People decide that a certain location matters. They organize space around that belief. They create boundaries, structures, and objects that distinguish the site from ordinary surroundings. And when such a place is suddenly transformed, the change can tell us something about the society that created it. At Gournay-sur-Arondel, the evidence of burning adds another layer. Fire can be accidental. It can be connected to conflict. It can result from deliberate closure. It can also be part of a ritual process. Without enough evidence, it is dangerous to choose one explanation simply because it sounds dramatic. The available information identifies the site as a burned Celtic sanctuary and presents its destruction as a mystery. It does not provide a definitive explanation for why the burning occurred, so the central question remains open, and that uncertainty is more interesting than an invented answer. Imagine the sanctuary when it was still functioning. The landscape would not have appeared as an archaeological site. It would have been a meaningful place. People would have approached it with expectations. Objects would have had specific roles. The boundaries of the sanctuary would have been understood. The space would have been connected to traditions that made sense to the people who used it. To them, the sanctuary was part of a living cultural world. To modern archaeologists, it is evidence. That difference creates a strange transformation. A place that once carried immediate meaning becomes a collection of clues. The original visitors did not need to ask what the sanctuary was for. They already knew. Modern researchers have to reconstruct the answer, and the burned remains make that reconstruction more difficult. Fire changes materials, it alters structures, it can destroy information while preserving other traces. A wooden element may disappear. Stone may survive. Objects may be damaged. Surfaces can change. The archaeological site becomes a record of both construction and destruction. But destruction itself does not automatically explain intention. This is one of the most important principles when interpreting ancient ruins. A burned building tells us that burning occurred. It does not, by itself, tell us why. That distinction can be easy to forget. A dramatic archaeological image encourages a dramatic story. But the evidence may support several possibilities. Perhaps the sanctuary was deliberately closed. Perhaps it was destroyed during a period of instability. Perhaps the fire was part of a ritual act. Perhaps another explanation fits the surviving evidence better. Without a definitive source, those possibilities should remain separate from established fact. That is what makes Gournay-sur-Arondel so useful as a historical mystery. The site gives us evidence of an event, but the meaning of that event is harder to reconstruct. This is especially important because sacred spaces can be treated differently from ordinary buildings. A community may deliberately alter or dismantle a ritual space when its function changes. A structure may be closed. Objects may be removed, placed, or destroyed according to practices that are meaningful within the culture. The physical result can look strange to modern observers because we no longer share the same system of beliefs. What appears to be destruction may have had a particular cultural meaning. But that possibility cannot automatically be applied to Gournay-sur-Arondel without supporting evidence. The mystery remains because the evidence does not give us a complete explanation. This uncertainty creates an important question about archaeology. How do we distinguish an accidental event from a deliberate act? Researchers look at patterns. They examine where evidence appears. They study how structures relate to one another. They compare objects. They consider the condition of materials. They look for signs that might indicate a particular sequence of events. No single feature necessarily solves the puzzle. Instead, interpretation comes from multiple pieces fitting together. At Gournay-sur-Arondel, the burned sanctuary becomes a historical puzzle because the surviving remains preserve only part of that sequence. We know the site was a sanctuary. We know burning occurred. That the complete story connecting those facts is not supplied by the evidence summarized here. That gap is important. It prevents us from turning uncertainty into certainty. The people who used the sanctuary would have understood the significance of what happened there. If the burning was deliberate, they may have known exactly why. If it was accidental, those who witnessed it would have known the circumstances. If it was connected to changing traditions, the community would have understood the transition. Modern researchers do not have that direct access. They have the aftermath. and aftermaths are notoriously difficult to interpret without witnesses. Consider what happens when a modern building burns. A photograph of the remains can tell you that there was a fire, but the photograph alone cannot tell you whether the fire began accidentally, whether someone caused it intentionally, or what decisions were made afterward. Investigators need additional evidence. Archaeologists face the same basic problem, except their witnesses are thousands of years gone. They cannot interview the people who were there. They must reconstruct the event from material traces. That makes archaeological interpretation both fascinating and frustrating. Every clue matters. But every clue also has limits. The sanctuary's burned condition, therefore, should not be treated as proof of a particular story. Instead, it should be understood as evidence of change. At some point, the sanctuary's history took a dramatic turn. The place that had once functioned as a sacred environment was transformed. Its original role eventually became part of the archaeological past. That transition raises questions about the community itself. What happened to the traditions associated with the sanctuary? Did they continue somewhere else? Did the community change? Did the meaning of the site change? Was the sanctuary replaced? Or did its use simply end? The available summary does not provide answers, and that is where the mystery remains. There is another reason the site is important. Archaeological remains can preserve evidence of actions that written records never mention. A written account might explain a political decision, but a sanctuary may preserve the physical traces of cultural practices that were never recorded in detail. This makes sites like Gournay-sur-Arondel especially valuable. They provide a direct material connection to a society whose worldview cannot be recovered completely through surviving texts. The sanctuary tells us that people created a dedicated ritual environment. Its burned remains tell us that something changed, but the complete meaning of that change remains uncertain. That is enough to make the site historically significant. We do not need to invent hidden ceremonies or dramatic final moments. The real mystery already exists in the evidence. A sacred place was constructed. People used it. Something happened. The sanctuary was burned. And the sanctuary was burned, and the exact reason remains unclear. That sequence is simple, but the implications are not. It forces us to think about how communities end, transform, or abandon places that once mattered deeply to them. Modern people often assume that sacred spaces remain sacred indefinitely. History shows that meanings can change. A place that is central to one generation may become irrelevant to another. A tradition can disappear. A new political or cultural environment can emerge. Buildings can be reused. Sanctuaries can be abandoned. And sometimes the physical remains provide the only surviving evidence that the original tradition existed. Gournay-sur-Arondel therefore offers a glimpse into a cultural world that is no longer directly accessible. The people who understood the sanctuary are gone. Their explanations are incomplete. Their beliefs cannot simply be reconstructed from modern assumptions. What remains is architecture, material evidence, and the question of what happened. That is the essence of the mystery. There is also something important about the word burned. Fire is visually powerful. It immediately creates an image of destruction. But archaeologically, burning can mean many things. A structure can be damaged by fire. A site can be deliberately burned. Materials can be burned as part of a ritual. A fire can spread unintentionally. The physical evidence may sometimes help distinguish between these possibilities, but the summary does not provide enough information to establish one definitive interpretation. Therefore, the responsible documentary approach is to preserve the uncertainty. That does not weaken the story, it strengthens it, because the mystery is not manufactured. It comes from the limits of the surviving record, and those limits are common throughout ancient history. A civilization can leave monuments without leaving explanations. A ritual can leave objects without leaving instructions. A sanctuary can leave ruins without leaving a clear account of why it ended. This is why archaeological sites can feel like messages from another world. They were created by people who understood them completely. Then time removed the context. What remains is enough to prove that something meaningful happened, but not always enough to explain exactly what it meant. Gournay-sur-Arondel sits within that boundary. The burned sanctuary is a physical record of a transformation. but the cause and meaning of that transformation remain difficult to establish from the information available. The uncertainty also reminds us that history is not always a continuous narrative. Sometimes there are sharp breaks. A functioning site becomes abandoned. A tradition stops appearing in the archaeological record. A structure is changed. A community moves on. And the reasons may disappear with the people who experience them. This is one reason the study of ancient cultures requires humility. Modern observers have enormous technological advantages. We can map sites digitally. We can analyze materials scientifically. We can reconstruct architecture virtually. We can compare evidence across enormous distances. But none of those tools can recreate information that was never preserved. Technology can analyze surviving evidence. It cannot manufacture missing history. That is the challenge at Gunay-sur-Arundel. The sanctuary can be studied. Its remains can be documented. Its architecture can be examined. The evidence of burning can be investigated. But the complete explanation for why the sanctuary was burned remains uncertain within the information provided, and that uncertainty should stay visible. There is no reason to turn the site into a legend. Its real history is already fascinating. A Celtic community created a sanctuary. The site became part of its cultural landscape. At some point, the sanctuary was burned. The meaning of that event has not been completely recovered. That is enough. Because beneath every archaeological mystery is a very human truth. The people who created these places knew exactly what they were doing. They did not think of themselves as leaving mysteries for future generations. They were simply living within their own world. Their buildings had purposes. Their rituals had meanings. Their decisions had reasons. But history can preserve the action while losing the explanation. That is what happened here. The sanctuary remains as evidence. The people who could have explained its final transformation are gone. The fire remains visible in the archaeological record. Its full meaning does not. And so Gunay-sur-Arundel stands as a reminder that sometimes the most difficult historical questions are not about discovering what happened. They are about understanding why. The stones can tell us that a sanctuary existed. The burned remains tell us that its story changed, but the final explanation remains hidden in the silence between those two facts. The giant stone circles near Sarmatian settlements across the ancient landscape. Some structures are easy to understand. A wall suggests a boundary. A road suggests movement. A house suggests habitation. A workshop suggests production. But then there are structures whose purpose seems to resist even the most basic explanation. Among them are the giant stone circles found near Sarmatian settlements. Their scale makes them immediately striking. Their location makes the mystery even more interesting. They were positioned near communities associated with the Sarmatians, yet the surviving evidence does not provide a definitive explanation for what these enormous circles were actually built to accomplish. Were they ceremonial spaces? Did they have a practical function? Were they connected to beliefs about the landscape? Could they have served several purposes at different times? The evidence summarized here does not allow one answer to be established with certainty. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes these structures so fascinating. Imagine approaching one of these circles when it was still part of an active ancient landscape. The stones would not have looked like archaeological ruins. They would have been part of the world around them. People would have known the location. They would have understood whether the space was important, ordinary, restricted, or communal. The arrangement would have made sense within the culture that created it. But today, the same stones stand without the original explanation. We can see the structure, we can measure it, we can map its position, we can compare it with other archaeological sites. Yet the central question remains: why was it built? That question becomes more difficult when a structure is monumental. Large construction requires effort. Moving or positioning heavy stones is not a casual activity. A community has to invest labor. People have to organize the work. Someone has to decide that the project is worth doing. And once the stones are arranged, someone has to understand what the finished structure means. The giant circles therefore represent more than mysterious objects in the landscape. They are evidence of collective decision-making. Some group of people considered these structures important enough to create. That fact alone tells us something about the society that produced them. but it does not tell us exactly what they meant. This is one of the central difficulties in interpreting ancient monuments. Modern observers often assume that a large structure must have had one clearly defined purpose, but ancient people did not necessarily separate functions in the same way we do. A space could have social importance as well as ritual significance. A location could serve a practical purpose while also carrying symbolic meaning. A monument could change function over generations. A structure built for one reason might later be reused by another community. Without written explanations, it can be extremely difficult to separate these possibilities. The stone circles near Sarmatian settlements therefore remain open to interpretation. Their relationship to surrounding communities provides an important clue. They were not isolated from human activity. Their location suggests that they belong to a wider cultural landscape. But proximity does not automatically establish function. A structure near a settlement may be connected to it. It may also have served a broader regional purpose. It could have been used by people who lived nearby or by visitors who came from elsewhere. The evidence must determine the connection. And when the evidence is incomplete, uncertainty remains. That is not unusual in archaeology. In fact, it is one of the discipline's most important realities. Archaeologists frequently encounter structures that clearly reflect human intention, but whose original meaning is difficult to reconstruct. A monument can survive while its cultural vocabulary disappears. The stones remain. The beliefs do not. The architecture remains. The explanation becomes uncertain. This is especially true when dealing with ritual or symbolic spaces. Modern people tend to search for familiar categories. Was it a temple? Was it an observatory? Was it a burial structure? Was it a meeting place? Was it a defensive installation? But those categories come from our own way of organizing the world. The ancient builders may not have thought of the structure in any of those terms. It may have served a purpose that does not fit neatly into a modern category. That possibility makes the stone circles particularly interesting. The available summary identifies their purpose as unknown. It does not establish a definitive ritual, astronomical, military, or domestic function. So the mystery should remain focused on that uncertainty. The most reliable fact is the monument itself. The stones were arranged deliberately. They formed large circular structures. They existed near Sarmatian settlements, and their precise purpose remains unclear. Everything beyond those points requires careful interpretation. That restraint is important because ancient monuments often attract extraordinary theories. A strange structure can quickly become evidence for almost anything, but a serious historical investigation has to resist that temptation. The fact that we do not know the answer does not mean that every possible answer is equally likely. It simply means the available evidence has not produced a definitive conclusion. That distinction separates historical mystery from fantasy. The giant stone circles do not need an invented secret. Their existence is already unusual enough. Consider the landscape in which they stood. The ancient communities associated with the Sarmatians lived within environments where movement, seasonal activity, and access to resources mattered. The surrounding landscape was not empty. It was a space used by people. Animals moved through it. Communities occupied it. Paths connected different locations. Settlements created centers of human activity. A monumental circle placed within such an environment would have become part of that landscape. Its position could have mattered as much as its shape. But again, without enough evidence, we cannot confidently say why. This is where archaeological context becomes essential. Researchers would naturally examine the relationship between the circles and nearby settlements. They would consider their orientation. They would document the stones. They would study the surrounding terrain. They would look for associated artifacts or structures. They would ask whether similar circles appear elsewhere. Each of these questions can help narrow interpretation, but narrowing the possibilities is not the same as proving one explanation. That is particularly important when a structure has survived without the original cultural context. A modern observer sees stones. An ancient community saw meaning. That difference can be enormous. Imagine that the original builders gathered around the completed circle. Perhaps they used it for a communal activity. Perhaps it marked an important location. Perhaps it was connected to beliefs or traditions. Perhaps it had a practical function that seems unfamiliar today. Whatever its purpose, The people who created it would not have experienced the same uncertainty we do. They knew the mystery belongs to the future. That is one of the strange effects of time. Human beings create things for immediate reasons. Future generations inherit the remains without necessarily inheriting the explanation. A stone circle can therefore outlive the very culture that made it meaningful. The structure survives. The tradition disappears. Eventually, researchers discover the monument and ask the same question the original builders never expected anyone to ask. What was this for? The question becomes even more intriguing when the monument is enormous. Scale often changes interpretation. A small circle could be created quickly. A giant one requires more commitment. Large stones need to be selected. They need to be positioned. The site needs to be organized. The work may involve many people. That suggests that the monument mattered to someone. But importance does not automatically tell us the type of importance. A structure can be socially important without being religious. It can be symbolically important without being a temple. It can be connected to communal identity without serving a practical purpose. The circles therefore challenge simplistic categories. They remind us that ancient landscapes were often multifunctional. People did not necessarily divide sacred social, economic, and political spaces into the same neat categories modern observers might expect. A place could carry several meanings at once, and those meanings could change. This is why the stone circles should be approached as evidence rather than conclusions. Their existence tells us that the communities connected to them invested effort in monumental construction. Their location tells us that they formed part of a wider landscape. Their unknown purpose tells us that some part of the cultural explanation has been lost. That is enough to make them significant. There is also a fascinating issue of scale and memory. Monuments are often built because people want something to endure. Stone has obvious advantages. It survives, it can withstand weather. It can remain visible long after temporary structures disappear. But durability does not guarantee meaning. A monument may survive for thousands of years while its original significance fades. That creates an ironic situation. The builders succeeded in preserving the physical structure. They did not necessarily preserve the explanation. Modern researchers can see the monument but not fully understand the message. The stone circles therefore demonstrate that memory has two parts. There is physical memory and there is cultural memory. Physical memory can survive in stone. Cultural memory depends on people. When the people and traditions disappear, the physical structure may become mysterious. This is one of the most powerful ideas in archaeological research. A monument does not exist in isolation. It once belonged to a community. Its meaning came from relationships between people, beliefs, places, and traditions. Remove those relationships, and the monument becomes harder to interpret. That is precisely the challenge presented by the giant stone circles near Sarmatian settlements. We can recognize their deliberate construction. We can recognize their scale. We can recognize their location. But the surviving information does not tell us exactly what they were for. The temptation is to fill the silence with a dramatic explanation. But responsible history does something different. It leaves the question open. That does not make the story less compelling. It makes the uncertainty itself the subject. There is something deeply fascinating about knowing that people thousands of years ago stood beside the same stones. They knew what those stones represented. They may have walked around them, gathered near them, passed them on journeys, or incorporated them into traditions that made perfect sense within their own world. Then the generations changed. The settlements changed. The traditions changed. And eventually the explanation became inaccessible. The stones remained. This is why ancient landscapes can feel so strange. They contain physical evidence of decisions whose reasoning has disappeared. A modern visitor can stand in the exact place where an ancient community once stood and still have no idea what the builders intended. The physical distance may be small. The cultural distance is enormous. That gap is what creates the mystery. The giant circles also remind us that archaeological silence can be meaningful. When there are no surviving texts explaining a monument, we are forced to rely on the structure itself. Its shape, its location, its materials, its relationship to other sites, its archaeological context. These clues may eventually produce stronger interpretations. But until they do, the correct conclusion is uncertainty. The circles remain unexplained, and that is not an invitation to imagine anything we want. It is an invitation to keep asking better questions. Why this location? Why this scale? Why a circular arrangement? Why near these settlements? How was the construction organized? What did the community see when they looked at the finished monument? Those questions are more valuable than unsupported answers. They turn the stone circles into a window onto an ancient society whose priorities are only partly visible. The mystery is therefore not simply about stones. It is about human intention. Someone decided to build something enormous. Someone believed the effort was worthwhile. Someone understood its meaning. That meaning has not survived clearly enough for modern researchers to recover it with certainty. And perhaps that is the most haunting feature of ancient monuments. They can preserve the evidence of human ambition long after the reason for that ambition has disappeared. The giant stone circles near Sarmatian settlements stand in that strange space between certainty and silence. Their stones are tangible, their construction was deliberate, their place in the ancient landscape was real. But the purpose remains unknown. Thousands of years later, the structures continue to occupy the landscape as they once did, quietly, permanently, and without explaining themselves. The people who built them knew why. The people who came after them may have known, but eventually that knowledge was lost. What remains is a circle of stones, an ancient landscape, and a question that archaeology has not yet been able to answer completely. History gives us ruins, fragments, symbols, forgotten cities, abandoned sanctuaries, and objects that somehow survived when the people who created them did not. But perhaps the strangest part is not that some mysteries remain unsolved. It is how much of the past has disappeared completely. A city can vanish, an archive can be lost, a kingdom can fade from the record. A monument can survive for thousands of years while the meaning behind it slowly disappears. And every unanswered question reminds us of the same uncomfortable truth. We do not possess all of history. We possess what survived. The rest exists only as gaps, fragments, and possibilities. Maybe one day, another excavation will uncover a missing piece, a forgotten inscription, a buried chamber, a single artifact that changes how an entire mystery is understood. Or perhaps some answers are gone forever. And maybe that is what makes the ancient world so fascinating. The past does not always give us conclusions. Sometimes it leaves us questions. Questions that survive longer than the people who created them. So, when you look at an ancient ruin, remember that you may not be looking at the whole story. You may be looking at what history failed to erase. And somewhere beneath those stones, beneath forgotten cities and silent landscapes, there may still be stories waiting to be understood. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's strangest mysteries, subscribe for more documentaries exploring the places, discoveries, and unanswered questions that continue to challenge what we think we know about the past.